They say a king without mercy builds empires. But what happens when the empire he built turns that mercy into a noose around his own throat? This is the story of Malrik Vaelor, the Black Wolf of Ashmourne, who created the perfect weapon and then made the fatal mistake of teaching it to think. If you want to know how a predator becomes prey in his own kingdom, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is watching. The execution platform stood in the center of Ashmourne's main square, built from the same black volcanic stone as the throne room itself. 15 years of public deaths had stained the wood dark enough that no amount of scrubbing could lift the color anymore. The scaffold didn't need decoration. Everyone in the capital knew what it meant. This morning, it waited for an omega. Malrik Vaelor stood at the window of his war chamber, 3 stories above the square, watching workers test the trapdoor mechanism. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man whose face had been carved by violence into something that made grown soldiers look away. Dark hair pulled back tight, scars crossing his jawline like territorial markers, eyes the color of winter iron. The Black Wolf King. The man who turned political dissent into fertilizer. He'd stopped counting bodies years ago. His war chamber smelled like leather, smoke, and the particular staleness that came from making decisions that killed people before breakfast. Maps covered every wall, marked with red ink showing territories conquered, rebellions crushed, bloodlines erased. A strategy table dominated the center of the room, littered with reports his generals had delivered at dawn. All of them said the same thing. Execute her. Make it public. Make it slow. Show the empire what happens when loyalty breaks. The door opened without knocking. Only one person in the kingdom had that privilege. General Casimir entered, his military boots heavy against stone. A wolf in his 60s who'd served 3 kings and helped bury 2 of them. His face carried the particular exhaustion of men who'd watched empires devour themselves from the inside. "You still standing here," Casimir said. "Like standing is going to change what needs doing." Malrik didn't turn from the window. Down in the square, a crowd was already gathering. Merchants closing shops early. Mothers pulling children close. Nobles positioning themselves for the best view. Public executions drew crowds the way carrion drew vultures. "When's the last time you slept?" Casimir asked. Malrik's jaw tightened. "Sleep is what weak kings do when they trust their kingdoms not to burn. You've been awake for 3 days. Your council is starting to notice. Let them notice." The general moved to stand beside him at the window. For a moment, both men watched the platform below in silence. Workers were dragging out chains now, heavy iron links that would hold a prisoner upright while the sentence was read. "She killed 6 of your personal guard," Casimir said quietly. "Broke out of a locked cell in the royal dungeon. Made it halfway to the northern border before trackers brought her down. The girl is dangerous, Malrik. More dangerous than anyone expected." Malrik's reflection in the glass showed nothing. "I trained her to be dangerous. Then you should have trained her better loyalty." The words landed like stones in deep water. Malrik finally turned away from the window, facing the general who'd been the closest thing to a father figure he'd ever allowed himself. Casimir's expression carried something worse than judgment. Concern. "You're making this personal," Casimir continued. "The entire court can see it. They're watching you fall apart over an omega who tried to gut you in your own throne room. She had reasons." Casimir's eyes narrowed. "You're defending her. I'm stating facts. Facts don't explain why you've delayed her execution 4 times. The general stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The court is starting to ask questions you don't want them asking. They're wondering if the Black Wolf King has developed a weakness. And the moment they smell weakness, the knives come out." Malrik felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd felt it before. The particular pressure that came right before kingdoms collapsed. "How bad is it?" he asked. Casimir pulled a sealed letter from his jacket and placed it on the strategy table. 3 noble houses have sent formal inquiries about succession protocols. Just inquiries. Nothing treasonous. Not yet. Malrik stared at the letter like it was a coiled snake. "Not yet," he repeated. "They're testing the water, seeing if you're still the king who burns rebellions before they breathe, or if you've become something else, something they can work around." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Malrik had built his empire on a simple principle. Fear worked better than love because fear was predictable. Love made rulers vulnerable. Love turned kings into targets. Love was the disease that killed more empires than war ever could. For 15 years, he'd been merciless. For 15 years, it worked. Until her. Nyra Vale had been dragged into his throne room in chains 8 months ago, captured during a failed border uprising. An Omega healer from a mountain pack so insignificant, most maps didn't bother marking it. She'd stood before him bruised, starving, and glaring like she wanted to rip his throat out with her teeth. The court had demanded execution. His generals had demanded torture. But Malrik had looked at this half-dead Omega and seen something far more valuable than another corpse. Potential. So instead of killing her, he'd made a decision that horrified the Empire. He turned her into a weapon. He'd ordered Nyra trained inside the Royal War compound among elite assassins, strategists, and military wolves. She would become his personal operative, loyal only to the crown, shaped entirely by his hand. The kingdom thought he was creating a monster for war. What nobody realized was that he was building the one person capable of destroying him completely. Casimir's voice cut through his thoughts. You need to end this today, publicly, brutally. Remind the Empire why they fear you. Malrik looked down at the execution platform. Workers were finishing their preparations now. The crowd was growing larger. Anticipation rippled through the square like electricity before a storm. Bring her up, he said quietly. Casimir nodded once and turned toward the door. Then he paused, hand on the frame. For what it's worth, the general said without looking back, I think you did what you thought was right, training her, trying to give her purpose. But some weapons are too sharp to hold safely. Eventually they cut the hand that wields them. The door closed. Malrik stood alone in his war chamber, surrounded by maps of territories he'd conquered and reports about conspiracies growing in the dark. Outside, the capital city of Ashmourne prepared to watch an Omega die. And inside, the Black Wolf King felt the first crack forming in the empire he'd built from blood and terror. The dungeons beneath Ashmourne Palace ran deep enough that screaming never reached the surface. 5 levels of cells carved into volcanic rock, each level reserved for different categories of prisoner. Thieves and debtors on the first level, political dissidents on the third, traitors on the 5th. Nyra Vale was kept on the 6th level, the one that officially didn't exist. 2 royal guards descended the spiral staircase cut into raw stone, torches casting shadows that moved like living things against the walls. Their boots echoed in the silence. Neither man spoke. Down here, words felt like violations. The 6th level contained exactly 3 cells. 2 stood empty. The third held the Omega who'd tried to assassinate the king. She sat against the far wall when they arrived, chains running from iron cuffs on her wrists to bolts in the stone. Her head was tilted back, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. Dried blood crusted her temple where guards had clubbed her during recapture. Her clothes hung in rags. Her feet were bare. She looked like something the Empire had chewed up and spit out, but she didn't look broken. The first guard unlocked the cell door. The second kept his hand on the sword at his hip, watching her the way men watch predators in cages. Time to move, the first guard said. Nyra didn't open her eyes. Where? The platform. Public execution. King's orders. She smiled, teeth showing white against the blood and dirt on her face. Finally, she said, I was starting to think he'd lost his nerve. The guards exchanged glances. Most prisoners begged at this point, offered information, promised loyalty, screamed about injustice. This Omega smiled like she'd won something. The first guard approached cautiously, key ready to unlock her wrist chains. The second drew his sword completely, blade pointing at her throat. Any sudden moves and I open you up, the second guard warned. Nyra opened her eyes then. Dark brown, almost black in the torchlight. The kind of eyes that had seen things bad enough to stop fearing death. You won't, she said calmly. The guard's grip tightened on his sword. Try me. Her smile widened slightly. If you kill me down here, you rob the king of his public execution. And the Black Wolf doesn't forgive soldiers who steal his theater. You'll be in this cell by nightfall. The guard's jaw clenched, but his sword lowered. Because she was right. The first guard unlocked her chains quickly, professional, avoiding eye contact. The moment the iron cuffs fell away, Nyra rubbed her wrists where the metal had cut into skin. Fresh blood welled up in the grooves. She didn't seem to notice. The guards positioned themselves on either side of her, gripping her arms hard enough to bruise. They hauled her toward the cell door, boots scraping stone. Nyra walked between them without resistance. The climb back up through the dungeon levels took 20 minutes. Each level grew progressively lighter, progressively louder with the sounds of other prisoners. Moaning, crying, the wet cough of men dying slowly in the dark. Nyra listened to all of it with an expression like carved stone. When they finally reached ground level, sunlight hit like a physical blow. The guards had to pause, letting their eyes adjust. Nyra tilted her face toward the brightness, breathing deep. First natural light she'd seen in 6 days. They emerged into a courtyard behind the palace. More guards waited here, a full escort detail in black armor marked with the royal insignia. A wolf's head surrounded by flames. The Black Wolf's personal unit. The commander stepped forward, a massive alpha whose neck was thicker than most men's thighs. He looked Nyra up and down like she was livestock being led to slaughter. "The Crimson Fang," he said mockingly, "doesn't look so dangerous now." Nyra met his gaze without blinking. "I killed 6 of your brothers with my hands chained. Want to see what I can do with them free?" The commander's expression darkened. He moved fast, faster than a man his size should have been able to move, and backhanded her across the face hard enough to snap her head sideways. Nyra spat blood onto the cobblestones. Then she laughed, low and rough, like gravel in a river. The commander raised his hand again, but another voice cut through the courtyard. "Enough!" Everyone turned. General Casimir stood in the palace doorway, backlit by the interior lights. His expression was carved from granite. "The king wants her intact for the execution," Casimir said coldly. "If she dies before the platform, you die on the platform. Understood?" The commander lowered his hand slowly, fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Understood," he said through clenched teeth. Casimir's gaze shifted to Nyra. She stood there bleeding from the mouth, chains hanging from her wrists, surrounded by soldiers who wanted her dead. Still smiling. "Move her," Casimir ordered. The escort formed up around Nyra, 12 guards in tight formation. They marched her through the palace grounds toward the main square. Palace servants scattered out of their path. Nobles watched from windows. Whispers followed them like a plague. The Omega who betrayed the king. The weapon that turned against its master. The girl stupid enough to think she could survive disobedience. Nyra heard all of it, processed none of it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. 8 months ago, Nyra Vale had believed in exactly 3 things. Her pack, her healing skills, the mountains. Everything else was noise. She'd grown up in a village so remote that merchant caravans only visited twice a year. Her people were healers, herbalists, midwives. They survived by being too useful to kill and too isolated to threaten anyone. Neutrality through irrelevance. It worked for generations, until the border wars came. When Alpha King Malrik Vaelor decided to expand his territory northward, he didn't bother with diplomacy. He sent armies. Mountains that had belonged to independent packs for centuries became Drakkar property overnight. Villages that resisted were erased. Villages that surrendered were occupied. Nyra's pack chose resistance. It lasted 3 days. She remembered standing in the center of her burning village, surrounded by corpses of people she'd delivered as babies, watching royal soldiers pile bodies like firewood. Her alpha lay dead in the square, throat cut, eyes still open. The soldiers had pulled survivors into a line. Omega healers were valuable. Everyone else was expendable. A captain had walked down the line, examining prisoners like livestock. When he reached Nyra, he'd grabbed her chin, forcing her face up toward the light. "This one's strong," he'd said. "Good bones, decent teeth. She'll fetch a price." Nyra had headbutted him so hard his nose exploded across his face. Then she'd tried to run. They'd caught her before she made it 50 feet. The beating that followed broke 2 ribs and dislocated her shoulder. They'd chained her with the other survivors and started the 3-week march to Ashmourne. Half the prisoners died on the road. Nyra survived through hatred alone. When they finally dragged her into the throne room of Ashmourne Palace, she'd been ready to die. Expected it. Almost welcomed it. What she hadn't expected was the king himself. Malrik Vaelor sat on a throne carved from volcanic stone, wearing black armor that made him look like violence given human form. His eyes were the coldest thing Nyra had ever seen. Colder than winter in the high mountains. Colder than a corpse 3 days dead. The captain explained the situation. Omega Healer, from the Northern Uprising, killed 2 soldiers during capture. Violent, unstable, recommended execution. The court had murmured agreement. Malrik had stared at Nyra in silence for what felt like hours. Then he'd stood up, walked down from his throne, approached her directly. The entire court held its breath. He stopped inches away, looking down at this half-dead Omega, who glared at him like she could kill him with pure fury. "You want me dead?" Malrik had said quietly. It wasn't a question. Nyra had spat blood at his feet. Yes. The king had smiled then. Not a warm smile, not a kind smile. The smile of a predator recognizing another predator. Good, he'd said. Rage is useful. Fear is predictable. But rage makes people dangerous. And I need dangerous people. He'd turned to address the court. This Omega will be trained in the Royal War Compound. She will become an operative for the crown. Loyal, lethal, unbreakable. The court had erupted in protest. Malrik had silenced them with a single raised hand. Anyone who questions this decision can volunteer to train her themselves, he'd said softly. See how violent and unstable she really is. Nobody volunteered. Nyra had been dragged to the war compound that same night, and for 6 months, the Alpha King personally oversaw her transformation from healer to killer. But the war compound sat on the eastern edge of the palace grounds, surrounded by walls high enough to block out everything except sky. Inside, elite soldiers trained in combat techniques that had built the Empire's military reputation. Pain was the primary teaching method. Nyra learned to fight because failing meant bones breaking. She learned to kill because hesitation meant death. She learned to manipulate, deceive, and destroy because Malrik demanded perfection from the weapon he was forging. He visited the compound every morning, watching her spar, correcting her technique, pushing her past the limits of what Omegas were supposed to endure. The other trainees hated her. An Omega in a facility designed for alphas, an outsider contaminating their sacred warrior culture. They broke her nose, dislocated her jaw, fractured her collarbone. Malrik never intervened. He simply waited to see if she'd survive. She did. And every time Nyra got back up, bloodier and meaner than before, something shifted in the way the king looked at her, like recognition, like he was seeing himself reflected in her violence. The training sessions became longer, more intense, more personal. He taught her how to read political opponents, how to identify weakness in powerful men, how to weaponize silence and make people destroy themselves through their own paranoia. Late at night, when the compound was quiet, he'd sit across from her in the strategy room and talk about the nature of power. Fear is the only reliable currency, he'd said once. Love requires trust, trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability gets kings killed. Nyra had been wrapping her hands after a brutal sparring session, blood seeping through the cloth. "So you've never loved anyone?" she'd asked. Malrik had looked at her for a long moment. "I loved my brother," he'd said quietly. He was soft, kind. Everything I wasn't. When enemies realized they couldn't break me, they killed him instead. Sent me his head in a box with a letter explaining how easy it was to destroy the things I cared about. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. "How old were you?" Nyra had asked. 17. "What did you do?" Malrik's expression had gone completely blank, emotionless. "I burned their kingdom to the ground, every building, every field, every person who knew what they'd done. Then I built an empire on the ashes and made sure everyone understood that love was the weakness that killed my brother. Fear was the strength that avenged him." Nyra had finished wrapping her hands. "And you've been alone ever since." It wasn't a question. Malrik had stood up then, moving toward the door, but he'd paused in the threshold, silhouetted by torchlight from the corridor. "Being alone keeps people alive," he'd said. "Being loved gets them killed." Then he'd left, and Nyra had sat there in the dark strategy room, understanding for the first time that the Black Wolf King wasn't cruel because he enjoyed it. He was cruel because he was terrified. Terrified of caring about anyone enough to give enemies leverage. Terrified of being vulnerable. Terrified of becoming the soft, kind brother who'd gotten his head cut off for loving the wrong person. The realization should have made her hate him less. Instead, It made everything infinitely worse. Because somewhere in the process of teaching her to become ruthless, Malrik had accidentally taught her to understand him. And understanding was the first crack in the armor she'd built around her own heart. Good. The main square of Ashmourne was packed by the time they brought Nyra through the north entrance. Thousands of people crammed into the space, pressed shoulder to shoulder, all facing the execution platform. The crowd noise was deafening. Guards forced a path through the mass of bodies, shoving civilians aside. Nyra walked in the center of the formation, chains rattling with each step. People screamed at her, threw refuse, spat, traitor, monster, the Crimson Fang who turned against the crown. Nyra kept her eyes forward, expression blank. She'd learned how to ignore crowds in the war compound, how to shut down emotions until there was nothing left but cold calculation. Malrik had taught her that too. Feel nothing, he'd said during one particularly brutal training session. Emotions make soldiers hesitate. Hesitation makes soldiers dead. So Nyra felt nothing, not the impact of rotten fruit against her shoulders, not the burning hatred radiating from thousands of faces, not the fear clawing at the edges of her awareness. Nothing. They reached the platform. Stairs led up to the wooden structure, dark with old blood that had soaked into the grain. A noose hung from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. But the trapdoor mechanism sat unused. This wasn't a hanging. The platform held something else. A wooden post, 8 feet tall, with chains bolted to the top and bottom. Restraints designed to hold prisoners upright while sentences were carried out. Public executions in Drakkar took many forms. Beheading for nobles, hanging for commoners, burning for the worst offenders. Nyra looked at the post and the chains and understood immediately what the king had planned. He was going to make this last. The guards hauled her up the stairs. The crowd noise swelled to a roar, thousands of voices blending into a single wall of sound. They chained her to the post facing the palace, arms stretched above her head, ankles locked to the base. The position forced her spine straight, made breathing difficult. She could see the palace from here, could see the window of Malrik's war chamber 3 stories up. A figure stood in the window, watching. The royal herald stepped onto the platform, unrolling an official decree. He was an old beta with a voice trained to carry across crowds. When he spoke, the square fell silent. By order of Alpha King Malrik Vaelor, ruler of the kingdom of Drakkar, protector of the Iron Throne, the Omega known as Nyra Vale stands accused of high treason against the crown. The crowd murmured. The herald continued reading. The accused was granted extraordinary privilege, removed from execution after capture, trained among royal elites, given opportunities reserved for loyal subjects of noble blood. In exchange for this mercy, she was expected to serve the throne with absolute dedication. His voice hardened. Instead, she betrayed the king's trust. On the night of the 12th moon, she attacked His Majesty in his private chambers, killed 6 royal guards during her escape attempt, fled the capital with stolen intelligence regarding military operations. The crowd's murmur grew louder, angrier. The herald raised his voice. For these crimes, the accused has been sentenced to death by royal judgment. The method of execution will be determined by the king himself. He rolled up the decree and stepped back. The square held its breath. Every eye turned toward the palace, toward the window where the Black Wolf King stood, watching his weapon face the consequences of disobedience. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the palace doors opened. Malrik Vaelor emerged. He wore full royal regalia, black armor etched with silver, a cloak the color of dried blood, the crown of Drakkar resting on his head like a circle of iron thorns. He looked like death walking. The crowd parted as he crossed the square. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They simply watched the king approach the platform where his greatest failure stood chained and waiting. Malrik climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. He reached the top and stood directly in front of Nyra, close enough that only she could hear him speak. "Any last words?" he asked quietly. Nyra met his eyes, those cold winter iron eyes that had watched her transform from broken prisoner to deadly operative. "You taught me everything I know," she said. "Every skill, every tactic, every weakness in the system." Malrik's expression didn't change. "And now I'm going to use all of it," Nyra continued, voice steady despite the chains cutting into her wrists. Because you made one critical mistake. What mistake? You trained me to think for myself. You taught me to question authority, to identify corruption, to cut out rot before it spreads. She leaned forward as far as the chains allowed. You created exactly what you needed, she said softly. A weapon smart enough to recognize when the biggest threat to the kingdom is sitting on the throne. The words landed like a blade between ribs. For 3 seconds, Malrik stared at her in absolute silence. Then he turned to address the crowd. This Omega, he said, voice carrying across the square like thunder, was given every opportunity to prove her loyalty. She failed. She chose betrayal. She chose violence against the crown. The crowd roared approval. Malrik raised his hand for silence. But before her execution, I want the people of Ashmourne to understand something about the nature of mercy in this empire. He turned back to Nyra. Mercy is not weakness, he said. Mercy is strategic. I showed mercy to this prisoner because I believed she could be useful. I invested time, resources, and personal attention into her development. His voice hardened. That investment has been wasted, and when investments fail, they must be liquidated. He drew a knife from his belt, long blade, cruel edge, the kind designed for precision cutting. The crowd fell absolutely silent. Malrik stepped closer to Nyra, the knife catching sunlight. You want to know my mistake? He said quietly. Only for her. I'll tell you. He pressed the blade against her throat. Not hard enough to cut, just hard enough to make the threat real. My mistake, Malrik continued, wasn't training you to think. My mistake was believing you'd think like me. That you'd understand power requires sacrifice. That you'd accept cruelty as necessity. The blade pressed slightly harder. But you're still soft, he said. Still clinging to morality like it's going to save you. Still believing there's a difference between what I am and what you've become. Nyra felt blood begin to trickle down her neck. There is a difference, she said. Malrik's eyes darkened. What difference? You kill because you're afraid, Nyra said. I kill because I choose to. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a heartbeat, something shifted in Malrik's expression. Something that might have been recognition, or grief, or the particular pain that comes from seeing yourself reflected in someone else and hating what you've become. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold emptiness that had built an empire. Malrik lowered the knife, stepped back, turned to face the crowd. This execution is postponed, he announced. The square erupted in confusion, angry shouts, demands for blood. Malrik ignored all of it. The prisoner will be returned to the dungeons, he continued, while I determine an appropriate punishment for her crimes, one that properly reflects the severity of her betrayal. He looked at Nyra one final time. Death is too easy, he said quietly, too quick. What you deserve requires something far worse. Then he descended the platform stairs and walked back across the square toward the palace, leaving Nyra chained to the post, leaving the crowd in chaos. Leaving behind questions that would fester in the dark until they infected everything. The guards unchained her roughly, hauling her off the platform. The crowd screamed for her death, threw stones, pressed against the guard formation like a living thing trying to tear her apart. Nyra let them drag her, but her mind was racing, because she'd seen something in Malrik's eyes right before he lowered the knife. Hesitation. The Black Wolf King, who'd built an empire on merciless decisions, had hesitated. And hesitation was the first symptom of doubt. Doubt was the crack that brought kingdoms down. As they hauled her back toward the dungeons, Nyra started planning. Not her escape, something far more dangerous. The complete destruction of everything Malrik Vaelor had built. Starting with the man himself. The dungeons swallowed Nyra whole again, but this time felt different. The guards threw her into the same 6th-level cell with more violence than before, slamming the iron door hard enough to make the entire corridor ring like a bell. One of them spat through the bars before leaving. You should have died on that platform, he growled. Would have been cleaner. Nyra sat in the darkness, listening to their boots fade up the spiral staircase. Her wrists bled where the chains had cut deep during the platform spectacle. Her throat still burned where Malrik's blade had pressed against skin. But she was alive. And alive meant dangerous. She tilted her head back against the stone wall, eyes adjusting to the near-total blackness. The cell smelled like old blood and human waste and the particular dampness that came from being this far underground. Most prisoners would have broken down here, started screaming, started begging whatever gods they believed in for salvation. Nyra started planning. The king's hesitations on the platform wasn't weakness. It was something far more valuable. It was proof that Malrik Vaelor still had something human buried beneath all that calculated brutality, something that could be exploited, something that could be weaponized against him. He taught her that himself. Find the weakness in your opponent, he'd said during one of their late-night strategy sessions in the war compound. Then push on it until they break or adapt. If they break, you win. If they adapt, you've learned their limits. Nyra smiled in the darkness. Time to test the Black Wolf's limits. 3 floors above, Malrik stood in his war chamber staring at reports he couldn't focus on. The words blurred together. Revenue projections, border disputes, grain shortages in the eastern provinces. None of it mattered. His mind kept circling back to the platform, to Nyra chained and bleeding, to the way she'd looked at him right before he lowered the knife. No fear, no begging, just cold assessment, like she was measuring him for a coffin. General Casimir entered without knocking, carrying a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. The old soldier set them on the strategy table and poured without asking permission. "Drink," Casimir said. "I'm working. You're brooding. There's a difference." Malrik ignored the glass. The whiskey sat there like an accusation. Casimir drank his own portion in one swallow, then refilled it. The court is losing their minds. Half think you've gone soft. The other half think you're playing some brilliant long game they're too stupid to understand. Which half is right? The general's expression was unreadable. "I don't know anymore." Malrik finally looked up from the useless reports. "You think I made a mistake, not executing her?" "I think you made a choice," Casimir said carefully. "Whether it's a mistake depends on what you do next. What I do next is find a punishment that makes the Empire understand disobedience has consequences." The general poured more whiskey. "And what punishment fits the crime of making the Black Wolf King hesitate in public?" The words landed like a fist to the gut. Malrik's jaw tightened. "I didn't hesitate. You lowered the knife. In front of thousands of witnesses, you postponed an execution you'd already ordered. That's not strategy, Malrik, that's hesitation." Silence filled the war chamber like water filling a drowning man's lungs. Casimir leaned against the strategy table. "I've served 3 kings, watched 2 of them die." "You want to know what killed them?" Malrik said nothing. "Not armies," the general continued. "Not poison, not assassins in the night. What killed them was losing control of the narrative. The moment people started questioning whether the king was still in charge, the knives came out. Nobles, generals, even servants. Everyone wants to be on the winning side, and the second you look weak, you stop being the winning side. I'm not weak. Then prove it. Execute the girl at dawn, publicly. Make it brutal enough that nobody questions your authority ever again." Malrik turned away, moving to the window overlooking the main square. Workers were dismantling the execution platform. The crowd had dispersed hours ago, but the energy lingered. Anger, confusion, the particular electricity that came right before riots. "She said I kill because I'm afraid," Malrik said quietly. Casimir paused mid-pour. "What?" "On the platform. She said the difference between us is that I kill because I'm afraid, and she kills because she chooses to." The general set down the bottle. "Is she wrong?" Malrik watched the workers below struggle with the blood-stained wood. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. A man wearing a crown that suddenly felt heavier than iron had any right to feel. "When I was 17, he said, my brother was murdered because I loved him. Enemies couldn't break me, so they killed the one thing I cared about. Sent me his head in a box with a note explaining how easy it was." Casimir had heard this story before, but he stayed quiet. After that, Malrik continued, "I promised myself I'd never care about anything enough to give people leverage. I built this empire on fear because fear is predictable. Fear is controllable. Fear keeps people alive." He turned from the window. "But she's right. Every decision I've made for 15 years has been driven by the terror of becoming vulnerable again, of caring about something enough that it can be used to destroy me." The general picked up his whiskey glass, studying the amber liquid. So what are you saying? Malrik met his eyes. I'm saying I don't know if I can kill her. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Casimir drank slowly, processing. Then you need to figure it out fast, because the court is watching. The nobles are watching. The entire empire is watching. And the moment they realize the Black Wolf King can't kill one disobedient Omega, they'll start wondering what else you can't do. Malrik knew he was right. Knew that empires built on fear collapsed the second that fear became questionable. Knew that hesitation was the crack that brought down kingdoms. But knowing didn't change the fundamental problem. Somewhere in the process of teaching Nyra to become ruthless, he'd accidentally taught himself to care about whether she survived. And caring was the weakness that had killed his brother 15 years ago. Nyra spent 3 days in the 6th-level cell before the first visitor arrived. She'd been doing exercises to keep her muscles from atrophying, push-ups against the stone floor, squats in the limited space. The physical activity kept her mind sharp, kept the darkness from pressing in too close. Footsteps echoed down the spiral staircase. Multiple people. Torchlight flickered against the corridor walls. Nyra stood up, moving to the center of the cell, hands loose at her sides, ready for violence if it came. The cell door opened. General Casimir entered alone. 2 guards waited in the corridor behind him, hands on sword hilts. The old soldier looked at Nyra for a long moment, taking inventory, assessing threat level. "Sit down," he said finally. Nyra didn't move. "I'm comfortable standing." That wasn't a request. They stared at each other in the torchlight, 2 predators measuring distance. Finally, Nyra sat, back against the wall, legs crossed, expression neutral. Casimir stepped deeper into the cell, close enough to speak quietly without the guards overhearing. "You know what you did up there," he said. "On the platform. I told the truth. You made the king look weak in front of the entire capital. You forced him to choose between his authority and his conscience. That's not truth. That's psychological warfare." Nyra smiled slightly. "He taught me well." The general's expression hardened. "You think this is a game? You think you can manipulate the Black Wolf King and walk away intact? I think he's already broken. I think the Empire just hasn't noticed yet." Casimir moved fast, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her back against the stone wall. His grip was iron. His eyes were colder than the dungeon air. "You arrogant little fool," he growled. "You have no idea what you're playing with. Malrik Vaelor has burned kingdoms for less than what you've done. He's killed entire bloodlines because someone looked at him wrong." Nyra didn't struggle, just met his eyes steadily. "Then why am I still alive?" she asked. The general's grip tightened. "Because he's trying to decide if you're worth saving or worth destroying. And what do you think?" Casimir leaned closer. "I think you're a weapon that's too dangerous to exist. I think you'll either destroy him or destroy the Empire. Either way, you're a threat that needs eliminating." Nyra felt blood pounding in her ears, felt the pressure building behind her eyes, but she didn't break eye contact. "So kill me," she said quietly. "Right here, right now. Blame it on suicide. Tell the king I couldn't handle the guilt." Problem solved. The general's jaw clenched, but his hand loosened slightly. "I can't," he admitted, voice rough. "Because he'd never forgive me." Nyra smiled then, cruel and knowing. "That's the problem, isn't it? He cares. The Black Wolf King who built an empire on not caring about anyone actually cares whether I live or die. And that terrifies you." Casimir released her throat, stepping back. His expression was carved from granite. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "The court is pressuring him to execute you. Noble houses are sending letters demanding your death. Military commanders are questioning his judgment. Every day you stay alive, his authority erodes a little more." "Good." The general's eyes flashed. "You want the empire to collapse? I want the empire to change. And change requires breaking the old systems first." Casimir laughed, bitter and harsh. "You sound just like him. Same arrogance, same certainty that you know better than everyone else. Same willingness to burn everything down and call it progress. Maybe that's why he can't kill me. Because killing me would be like killing the only person who understands what it costs to become a monster for survival." The words settled in the cell like stones in deep water. Casimir turned toward the door, then paused in the threshold. He's planning something, the general said without looking back. I don't know what, but I've known Malrik long enough to recognize when he's in strategy mode. Whatever he's planning, it's going to change everything. Then I'll be ready. The old soldier glanced over his shoulder one last time. No, you won't, because you still think you can predict him. But the truth is, Malrik Vaelor is most dangerous when he stops being predictable. Then he left. The cell door clanged shut. Nyra sat in the darkness thinking about what the general had said. Planning something. Going to change everything. She ran through possibilities. Public execution with maximum brutality. Political marriage to a rival house to repair diplomatic damage. Permanent imprisonment as a living reminder of what happened to traitors. None of them felt right. Because Casimir was correct about one thing. Malrik was most dangerous when he stopped being predictable. And right now, the Black Wolf King was completely unpredictable. 4 days after the platform incident, Malrik called a full council meeting. Every noble house with blood ties to the crown. Every military commander above the rank of captain. Every advisor who'd served for more than 5 years. The throne room filled with powerful people who smelled blood in the water. Malrik sat on the volcanic stone throne, wearing full royal regalia, the crown, the armor, the cloak, every symbol of authority the Empire recognized. He looked like the king who'd crushed rebellions before they could breathe. But the people in that room knew better. They'd seen him hesitate on the platform. They'd watched his authority crack in real time. Now they were here to see if it shattered completely. Lord Theron of House Blackwater stood first. An alpha in his 50s with enough military victories to command respect. He addressed the king with the particular formality that barely disguised contempt. Your Majesty, we appreciate you calling this council. There are concerns that need addressing. Malrik's expression was carved ice. Address them. Theron glanced at the other nobles. Subtle confirmation they were united in this. The prisoner in the 6th-level dungeon, he said. Nyra Vale. Her continued existence is causing instability throughout the Empire. Common citizens question your resolve. Military units question your judgment. Noble houses question your strength. The throne room held its breath. What are you suggesting? Malrik asked quietly. Immediate execution, public, brutal. Restore confidence in the crown's authority. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles. Malrik stood up slowly. The movement silenced the room instantly. You think killing one Omega will restore authority, he said. Voice soft. Dangerous. Theron shifted his weight. With respect, Your Majesty, it's not about killing an Omega. It's about proving you're still capable of making hard decisions. The Empire was built on your willingness to be ruthless. The moment you hesitate, that empire begins to crumble. More murmurs, louder this time. Malrik descended from the throne, one step at a time, deliberate, controlled. The assembled nobles watched him approach like prey watching a predator circle. Let me tell you what I think, Malrik said. Still quiet, still dangerous. I think this council isn't about restoring authority. It's about testing whether I'm weak enough to be controlled. You want to see if I'll bow to pressure, if I'll make decisions based on what you demand rather than what I decide. He stopped in front of Lord Theron, close enough that only the first row of nobles could hear him clearly. And if I'm weak enough to be controlled, he continued, then I'm weak enough to be replaced. Theron's face went pale. Your Majesty, I would never lie to me again, and I'll have your tongue cut out. The throne room went absolutely silent. Malrik turned to address the full council. His voice carried now, loud enough for everyone. I built this empire by being ruthless, he said, by making decisions that turned my enemies into corpses and my allies into believers. I've burned kingdoms, erased bloodlines, turned political dissent into fertilizer for the royal gardens. He paused. But ruthlessness without purpose is just violence, and violence without strategy is chaos. The prisoner in the dungeons is valuable, not because I care about her survival, because she represents something this empire desperately needs. The nobles exchanged confused glances. What does she represent? Someone called out. Malrik smiled then, cold and sharp. Evolution, he said. For 15 years, I've ruled through fear alone. It worked. It built an empire. But empires that rely only on fear eventually collapse because fear breeds resentment and resentment breeds rebellion. The prisoner understands this. She's seen the consequences of pure intimidation. She's experienced what happens when power becomes its own justification. He turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with every noble in the room. So here's what's going to happen, he continued. Nyra Vale will not be executed. She will be integrated back into the royal court, not as a prisoner, as an advisor. The throne room erupted, shouts of protest, demands for explanation, accusations of madness. Malrik raised one hand, instant silence. Anyone who questions this decision, he said softly, can volunteer to replace her. Come down here. Stand before me. Prove you're more valuable than she is. Nobody moved. I thought so. He climbed back up to the throne, settling into the volcanic stone like it was made for him. This council is dismissed. Return to your houses, your territories, your duties. And remember that the Black Wolf King doesn't explain his strategies to people too stupid to understand them. The nobles filed out in stunned silence. Only General Casimir remained behind, standing near one of the massive pillars supporting the vaulted ceiling. When the last noble disappeared, he approached the throne. That was either brilliant or suicidal, Casimir said. Malrik stared at the empty throne room. Probably both. You can't actually bring her into the court. Half those nobles will try to have her killed. The other half will use her as a weapon against you. I know. Then what's the plan? Malrik stood up, removing the crown and setting it on the throne. The iron felt heavier than usual. The plan, he said quietly, is to remind everyone in this empire that I don't make decisions based on what they want. I make decisions based on what's necessary. And right now, what's necessary is showing them that the Black Wolf King is still dangerous enough to do whatever he wants, even if it destroys you. Malrik turned to face the general. Especially if it destroys me. Casimir stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You're in love with her. Malrik's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been acknowledgement or denial or the particular pain that came from not knowing the difference. That's irrelevant, he said. Is it? The king picked up the crown again, turning the iron circle in his hands. When I was 17, I watched my brother die because I loved him. I promised myself I'd never make that mistake again. Never care about anyone enough to give enemies leverage. He set the crown back down. But somewhere in the process of teaching that Omega to become ruthless, I accidentally taught myself that isolation isn't strength. It's just loneliness disguised as strategy. Casimir moved closer. So what now? Malrik looked at the empty throne room, at the volcanic stone walls engraved with defeated bloodlines, at the empire he'd built from blood and terror and calculated brutality. Now, he said quietly, I find out if it's possible to change without destroying everything I've built, or if evolution requires burning the old kingdom down completely. The general was quiet for a moment. Then, and if the empire can't handle that change, then the empire gets replaced with something better. Casimir exhaled slowly. You're gambling everything on the possibility that people will follow you through transformation instead of killing you for showing weakness. Yes, that's insane. Malrik smiled slightly. Then it's a good thing the Black Wolf King has always been a little insane. He walked out of the throne room, leaving the crown behind on the volcanic stone throne, leaving the general standing alone in the silence, leaving behind the certainty that had ruled the empire for 15 years, and walking straight toward the uncertainty that would either save him or destroy him completely. They brought Nyra up from the dungeons at midnight. No ceremony, no announcement, just 4 guards with torches and orders to deliver her to the king's private chambers. She didn't resist, didn't ask questions, just walked between them through corridors she'd memorized during her months in the war compound, past tapestries showing military victories, past suits of armor that had belonged to dead kings, past windows overlooking a capital city that slept uneasily beneath the weight of an empire built on fear. The guards stopped outside a set of heavy wooden doors carved with wolves tearing apart prey. The king's chambers. One guard knocked twice. Enter, came the response. They opened the doors and pushed Nyra inside, then closed them behind her, leaving her alone with the Black Wolf King. The chamber was massive. High ceilings, stone walls covered in maps and books, a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer, weapons mounted everywhere, swords, knives, a crossbow that looked ancient. Malrik stood by the window overlooking the city, still wearing his armor minus the crown and cloak. His back was to her. "Sit," he said without turning. Nyra scanned the room. One chair near the fireplace, a desk covered in correspondence, a bed in the far corner that looked like nobody had slept in it for days. She chose to stand. Malrik turned then, looked at her, really looked, taking inventory of the damage the dungeons had done, the weight she'd lost, the shadows under her eyes, the cuts on her wrists from the chains. "You look like hell," he said. "Your hospitality could use improvement." A ghost of a smile touched his face, then disappeared. He moved to the desk, pouring 2 glasses of water from a pitcher, brought one to her. Nyra took it, suspicious, waiting for poison. "It's just water," Malrik said. She drank anyway, too thirsty to care if it killed her. The king watched her drain the glass, then refilled it from the pitcher. "The council wants you dead," he said flatly. "The nobles, the military, even the servants. You've become a symbol of everything wrong with my rule. Then why am I here instead of on the execution platform? Because I'm done making decisions based on what other people want." Nyra set down the empty glass. "So what do you want?" Malrik was quiet for a moment, staring at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I want to know why you tried to kill me," he said finally. "The real reason. Not the political justification, not the moral posturing, the actual reason you put a knife to my throat in my own chambers." Nyra met his eyes. "Because you were becoming the thing you hate most." "What thing?" "Your father." The words hit like a blade between ribs. Malrik's expression went completely blank. Dangerous blank. The blank that came right before violence. "You don't know anything about my father. I know he was a tyrant who ruled through fear until his own generals stabbed him in his sleep. I know you watched it happen when you were 16. I know you built this entire empire swearing you'd never make his mistakes." She stepped closer. "But fear is all you know," she continued. "So you became exactly what you were trying to avoid. A king so terrified of losing control that you can't stop tightening your grip even when it's choking the life out of your own kingdom." Malrik grabbed her by the throat, slammed her against the stone wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. His face was inches from hers, eyes blazing with something that might have been fury or grief, or the particular madness that came from having someone speak truth you'd spent 15 years running from. "You think you understand me," he growled. "You think 6 months of training makes you an expert on what drives the Black Wolf King." Nyra didn't struggle, just stared back at him. "I think you taught me to recognize weakness disguised as strength," she said, voice rough from the pressure on her throat. "And right now, you're the weakest person in this empire because you're still letting a dead father control every decision you make." His grip tightened. She felt blood pounding in her ears, felt the edges of consciousness starting to blur. Then Malrik released her, stepped back, breathing hard. Nyra slid down the wall, gasping, rubbing her throat where his fingers had left marks. The king turned away, moving back to the window. His hands were shaking. "I brought you here," he said quietly, "because I'm going to offer you a choice." Nyra coughed, tasting blood. "What choice?" "Die tomorrow at dawn. Public execution, quick, relatively painless. The empire gets its justice. The nobles get their proof of strength. Everything goes back to normal. Or," he turned to face her, "or you become exactly what I told the council you'd be, an advisor, someone who can see the flaws in this empire because you've experienced them firsthand, someone who can help me transform this kingdom into something that doesn't require constant brutality to survive." Nyra stared at him, searching for the trap. "Why would you trust me after I tried to kill you?" Malrik's smile was sharp and bitter. "Because you're the only person in this empire who's honest enough to tell me when I'm wrong. Everyone else either fears me too much to speak truth or wants me dead too much to care about anything except destroying me. You do both, which makes you either the worst advisor imaginable or the only one worth having." The fireplace crackled in the silence. Nyra stood up slowly, testing her legs. "And if I accept," she said, "what then? Then we figure out if it's possible to change an empire without burning it to the ground, or if evolution requires complete destruction first. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." Nyra studied him. This man who'd captured her, trained her, almost killed her. The Black Wolf King who'd built an empire on fear and was now gambling everything on the possibility of transformation. He was either brave or insane. Probably both. What happened to the king who said love was a disease that weakened rulers? She asked. Malrik looked at her for a long moment. He learned that fear is a worse disease, he said quietly, because fear kills everything it touches, including the person who wields it. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Nyra felt something shift in her chest, something that might have been understanding or recognition or the first crack in the armor she'd built around her own heart. If I do this, she said slowly, I need guarantees. Name them. I answer to no one except you, not the council, not the generals, not the nobles. My authority comes directly from the crown. Agreed. I get access to all intelligence, all reports, all information about how this empire actually functions. Agreed. And if I determine that you're becoming a threat to your own kingdom, I reserve the right to remove you from power. Malrik's eyes flashed. By any means necessary. By any means necessary. They stared at each other in the firelight. Two predators who'd tried to destroy each other now negotiating an alliance that would either save the empire or tear it apart completely. You realize, Malrik said, that giving you that much power is probably the stupidest decision I've ever made. Nyra smiled, cruel and knowing. Then it's a good thing the Black Wolf King has always been a little stupid when it comes to matters of the heart. The words landed like stones in deep water, because both of them understood what was really happening here. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about strategy. This was about two broken people who'd spent their entire lives building walls around their hearts, now standing in the ruins, wondering if it was possible to let someone pass the defenses without destroying everything. Malrik extended his hand. Do we have an agreement? Nyra looked at his hand, scarred from years of violence, shaking slightly from exhaustion or emotion or both. Then she took it. The handshake sealed more than a political arrangement. It sealed the beginning of something that would either transform the empire or burn it to ashes, and neither of them knew which outcome was more terrifying. The first 3 weeks of Nyra's integration into the royal court went smoother than anyone expected. Too smooth. Like the calm before a storm that everyone could feel building but nobody could see approaching. Malrik had her moved from the dungeons to chambers in the east wing of the palace. Not luxurious, not meant to be. A bedroom with stone walls and minimal furniture. A desk. A window overlooking the training yards. Guards stationed outside her door at all times. Protection or imprisonment depending on how you looked at it. She didn't complain. Every morning she attended strategy meetings with the king's inner council. Military commanders who'd spent decades building the empire's reputation. Advisors who'd served 3 generations of rulers. Nobles whose bloodlines predated the throne itself. They hated her immediately. Not because she was incompetent, because she was too competent. She read supply chain reports and identified corruption the Treasury had missed for years. She reviewed border patrol schedules and found gaps that insurgents could exploit. She studied diplomatic correspondence and called out lies buried beneath formal language. Within a week, she'd exposed 2 corrupt officials, prevented a supply shortage that would have crippled the Eastern military, and identified an assassination plot against a visiting dignitary that the royal guard had completely missed. The nobles stopped calling for her execution, started calling her something worse. The king's creature, his pet weapon, the Omega who'd somehow bewitched the Black Wolf into trusting her. Nyra ignored the whispers. She'd survived worse than noble gossip. But what she couldn't ignore was the way Malrik watched her during those meetings. Like he was still trying to figure out if saving her was brilliant strategy or catastrophic weakness. Like he was waiting for the moment she'd prove everyone right and betray him again. Trust was a strange thing between predators. It required constant testing. One night, 2 weeks into her new role, Malrik summoned her to his private study. A smaller room adjacent to his chambers, lined floor to ceiling with books and maps and weapons collected from conquered territories. He stood at a table covered in correspondence when she arrived. His armor was off. Just a black shirt and trousers. Hair loose around his shoulders. He looked younger like this. Less like the Black Wolf King and more like a man carrying weight that would eventually crush him. "Close the door," he said, without looking up. Nyra did. The sound echoed in the quiet space. Malrik picked up a letter, holding it toward the firelight. "This arrived today. From Lord Theron of House Blackwater. He's formally requesting a private audience to discuss matters of imperial security. And you want my assessment. I want to know if he's planning to kill me or just destabilize my authority enough that someone else can do it for him. Nyra moved closer, reading over his shoulder. The letter was formal, polite. Every word calculated to seem reasonable while hiding the threat beneath. He's testing you, she said, seeing if you'll agree to meet him alone. If you do, he'll interpret it as weakness, proof that you're desperate enough for noble support to take unnecessary risks. And if I refuse, he'll use that as evidence you've become paranoid. Either way, he wins the narrative. Malrik set down the letter. So, what do I do? Nyra thought for a moment. Meet him, but not alone. Bring me. Make it clear that any conversation he has with you includes your advisor. It tells him two things. One, you're confident enough to meet him despite the threat. Two, you don't trust him enough to exclude witnesses. The king studied her. You're good at this. You taught me. I taught you to kill people. This is something else. Nyra met his eyes. You taught me that power is about perception, that the king who controls the narrative controls the kingdom. Killing is just one tool. There are others. Malrik was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to pour 2 glasses of wine from a decanter on his desk. Offered her one. She took it, suspicious by habit. It's not poisoned, he said. If I wanted you dead, I'd be more creative than wine. Nyra drank. The wine was good. Too good for someone who'd spent the last month in a dungeon. Malrik sat in the chair by the fireplace, gestured for her to take the other. She did. For a while, neither spoke. Just sat there drinking wine in the firelight like two normal people instead of a king and the weapon he'd forged from a captured prisoner. Finally, Malrik broke the silence. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Trying to kill me. Nyra considered the question. Honest answers were dangerous, but lies were worse. No, she said. You needed to be stopped. You were becoming everything you swore you'd never be, a tyrant drunk on power and terrified of losing it. Malrik's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. And now I don't know. You're trying to change, trying to build something better than fear and brutality. But trying doesn't mean succeeding. And the Empire is full of people who want you to fail because your failure gives them opportunities. So you're waiting to see if I actually transform or if I just talk about transformation while staying exactly the same. Yes. The honesty hung between them like a blade balanced on edge. Malrik drank his wine slowly. At least you're consistent. Nyra smiled slightly. You taught me that too. Consistency builds trust. The king looked at her then, really looked. Not as an advisor, not as a threat, as a person who'd seen him at his absolute worst and was still sitting here drinking wine instead of running as far away as possible. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, voice barely above whisper. I've spent 15 years building walls, learning to trust no one, keeping everyone at a distance so they can't be used against me. And now I'm trying to tear those walls down while the entire empire watches and waits for me to fall. Nyra set down her wine glass. You want to know the real difference between you and your father? Malrik tensed. What difference? Your father never questioned himself, never wondered if he was wrong, never tried to change even when the kingdom was collapsing around him. You're sitting here terrified that you might be making mistakes. That fear is what separates tyrants from leaders. Leaders doubt themselves. Tyrants don't. The words settled in the quiet room like snow falling on stone. Malrik stared into the fireplace. Flames reflected in his eyes. My brother used to say something similar, he said, before they killed him. He said the strongest kings were the ones brave enough to admit weakness. I thought he was naive, thought strength meant never showing vulnerability. Nyra leaned forward. What do you think now? I think he was braver than I ever gave him credit for. And I think I killed him by being too weak to protect what I loved. That's not weakness. That's being 17 and overwhelmed by people who wanted to destroy you. Malrik looked at her, vulnerability written across his face like scars. I'm terrified of caring about you, he said, voice raw. Because everyone I've ever cared about gets used as a weapon against me. And you're already the deadliest weapon in this empire. If someone figures out that you matter to me, they'll kill you just to watch me break. Nyra felt something twist in her chest. something that might have been fear or recognition or the first real crack in the armor she'd spent her entire life building. Then, "Don't care about me," she said quietly. "Keep me at a distance. Use me as a tool. That's safer for both of us." "Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Nyra didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was too dangerous to speak out loud. She was starting to care about him too. About this broken king trying to become something better than the monster the Empire had created. About the man beneath the crown who still grieved his brother 15 years later. About the predator who was learning that strength sometimes meant lowering your guard instead of reinforcing it. Caring was the weakness that destroyed rulers. But maybe it was also the thing that made them worth following. Lord Theron arrived at the palace 3 days later for his private audience with the king. He came with a small entourage, 6 guards in House Blackwater colors, 2 advisors, an official recorder to document whatever agreements might be reached. The meeting took place in a formal reception hall, neutral ground, neither throne room nor private chambers, somewhere that gave both parties equal footing. Malrik sat at the head of a long table carved from ancient oak, full royal regalia, crown, armor, the works, every symbol of authority on display. Nyra sat to his right. Simple clothes, no weapons visible, but her presence alone was statement enough. The king's advisor, the Omega who tried to kill him and somehow survived. Lord Theron entered with his entourage, bowed formally, took the seat across from Malrik with his people arranging themselves behind him like chess pieces. "Your Majesty," Theron began, voice smooth as oil. "Thank you for granting this audience." Malrik's expression was carved ice. "State your business." The noble glanced at Nyra, then back to the king. "I was hoping for a private discussion," he said carefully. "There are no private discussions in my court anymore. Anything you say to me, you say in front of my advisor." Theron's jaw tightened slightly. "Of course. As you wish." He pulled documents from the leather case his recorder carried, spread them across the table. Maps, reports, financial ledgers. "These documents," Theron said, "represent the current state of the Eastern Territories. Trade revenue, military expenditures, population movements, everything necessary to understand the region's stability." He paused for effect. "Or instability." Malrik leaned forward slightly. "Explain." "The eastern provinces are experiencing significant unrest, food shortages, increased taxation to fund military expansion, harsh enforcement of imperial law. The people are suffering, Your Majesty, and suffering people become desperate people." Nyra studied the documents. Numbers that told stories the noble wasn't speaking out loud. "You're saying the East is preparing to rebel," she said flatly. Theron looked at her, condescension barely hidden beneath courtesy. "I'm saying the East is a powder keg. Whether it explodes depends entirely on how the Crown responds." Malrik's eyes narrowed. "And how do you suggest the Crown respond?" The noble leaned back in his chair, casual, confident. "Loosen restrictions. Reduce taxation. Allow provincial governors more autonomy. Give the people breathing room before they decide suffocation is worse than rebellion." "Those are sensible policies," Nyra said, "which makes me wonder why you're really here." Theron's smile was thin. "I'm here because I care about the Empire's stability." Nyra picked up one of the financial ledgers, flipped through pages. This ledger shows House Blackwater has been buying grain futures in the eastern provinces, large quantities, enough to control food distribution if shortages continue. The room went very quiet. She set down the ledger, looked directly at Theron. "You're not here to prevent rebellion," she continued, voice cold. "You're here to position yourself as the solution when it happens. Food shortages create dependency. Dependency creates leverage. Leverage creates power. You want the king to ease restrictions so the rebellion doesn't happen yet. Not because you care about stability, because you need more time to consolidate control before the chaos starts." Theron's expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate observation." Malrik stood up. The movement made everyone in the room tense. "Get out," he said quietly. "Your Majesty, get out of my palace. Take your entourage. Take your documents. Take your grain futures and your carefully calculated instability. And understand that if the eastern provinces rebel, I will assume House Blackwater had something to do with it." Theron stood slowly. anger radiating from him like heat. "You're making a mistake," he said. "The Eastern Territories need leadership. If you refuse to provide it, someone else will. Then they can provide it from a position of loyalty instead of opportunism." The noble gathered his documents. His people moved toward the door. But before leaving, Theron turned back one last time. "You've changed," he said to Malrik. The Black Wolf King, "I knew would have had me executed for even suggesting dissent. But this version lets me walk away. Makes me wonder if the Empire was right to question your strength." Malrik smiled then, cold and sharp as winter iron. "The Black Wolf King you knew would have killed you because it was easier than strategy. This version lets you leave because I want everyone to see what happens to nobles who mistake patience for weakness. You're more useful alive as an example than dead as a martyr." He stepped closer. "So go back to your grain futures, your carefully planned rebellions, your political maneuvering, and when it all falls apart because you underestimated me, remember that you had this chance to walk away clean." Theron's face went pale, then he left. The door closed behind him. Malrik stood in the silence for a moment, then turned to Nyra. "How did you know about the grain futures?" "Because I spent the last week reviewing House Blackwater's financial records, looking for exactly this kind of positioning. You suspected him before the meeting even started. I suspected everyone. That's what you taught me. Trust is weakness. Verification is strength." Malrik's expression was unreadable. "You're terrifying. Good. That means I'm doing my job." But beneath the banter, both of them understood what had just happened. Lord Theron hadn't come here for negotiation. He'd come here to confirm his suspicions that the king had gone soft. And now he was going back to the Eastern Territories armed with proof that the Black Wolf could be manipulated through his new advisor. The real game was just beginning. 2 weeks after the Theron meeting, reports started flooding in from the eastern provinces. Small incidents at first. A tax collector beaten in the street. A garrison supply depot burned. Provincial governors sending urgent requests for military reinforcement. Then bigger incidents. An entire village refusing to pay imperial taxes. Regional militia groups forming in the mountains. Anonymous letters circulating through market towns calling for resistance against crown authority. The Eastern Territories were moving toward open rebellion, and everyone knew House Blackwater was orchestrating it from the shadows. Malrik called an emergency war council. Every military commander, every strategic advisor, General Casimir standing near the king like a stone pillar of experience and exhaustion. The war chamber filled with grim faces and grimmer assessments. Commander Drelt spoke first, a scarred alpha who'd spent 30 years putting down rebellions. "We need to move fast," he said. "Full military deployment to the eastern provinces. Crush the resistance before it spreads. Make examples brutal enough that other territories remember why they fear the crown." Several commanders nodded agreement. Malrik looked at Nyra. "What do you think?" She'd spent the last week analyzing every report, every incident, every pattern. "I think that's exactly what Theron wants us to do," she said. The commanders turned to stare at her. Commander Drelt's expression hardened. "Explain." "Military deployment requires moving troops from other regions. It costs resources, creates supply line vulnerabilities, and most importantly, it makes the crown look reactionary instead of in control. Theron has positioned himself as the moderate voice in the East. If we send in the military with brutal force, we prove him right. We become the tyrants he's been telling people we are." "So we do nothing," Drelth said, voice dripping sarcasm. "Let rebellion spread until the entire Eastern Territory is lost." "No. We respond strategically. Target the actual leaders. Cut off House Blackwater's financial support. Make it clear that this isn't crown versus provinces. It's crown versus nobles using provincial suffering for personal gain." The commander looked at Malrik. "Your Majesty, with respect, your advisor is suggesting we show weakness in the face of open rebellion." Nyra stood up, leaning over the strategy table. "I'm suggesting we show intelligence instead of predictable brutality. The old method worked when fear was enough. But fear alone doesn't work anymore. The Empire has changed. The people have changed. We need to change with them, or we'll end up exactly like every other kingdom that collapsed, because it couldn't adapt." Silence filled the war chamber. Several commanders exchanged glances, calculating whether to support this new approach or double down on traditional methods. General Casimir cleared his throat. "The girl has a point," he said, grudging respect in his voice. We've been fighting rebellions the same way for decades. Overwhelming force. Maximum brutality, it works short term, but it breeds resentment that eventually explodes into something worse. He looked at Malrik. Maybe it's time to try something different. The king studied the maps spread across the strategy table. Eastern provinces marked in red. Supply routes in blue. Military positions in black. 15 years of building an empire on fear, now being asked to build something else, something untested, something that required trusting people instead of terrifying them. Malrik made his decision. We do it Nyra's way, he said. Targeted operations against House Blackwater. Cut their funding. Expose their manipulation. Show the eastern provinces that the crown isn't their enemy. Corrupt nobles are. Commander Drelth's face reddened. Your Majesty. That's an order. Anyone who disagrees can submit their resignation. Nobody resigned. But Nyra saw the looks exchanged between commanders, the subtle shake of heads, the expressions that said the king had finally gone too far. The meeting dispersed, commanders filing out muttering under their breath. Only Casimir remained behind. He approached Malrik slowly, old soldier walking like every joint hurt. You're gambling everything on a strategy that's never been tested, he said quietly. I know. If it fails, the eastern territories fall. If they fall, other regions will follow. The empire collapses from the inside. I know. Casimir looked at Nyra, then back to the king. She's brilliant, he admitted. Ruthless, strategic, everything you wanted her to be, but she's also an outsider. Someone who doesn't understand how empires actually survive. Power requires force, always has, always will. The moment you stop being willing to crush threats absolutely, you stop being powerful enough to rule. Malrik's jaw tightened. My father believed that, and his own generals killed him in his sleep because they were more afraid of him than loyal to him. Fear is still power. No, fear is just fear, and I'm done ruling through it. The general sighed. Then I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, neither of us will live long enough to regret it. He left, leaving Malrik and Nyra alone in the war chamber. They stood on opposite sides of the strategy table, maps between them, decisions that would determine whether the empire survived or collapsed. You think I'm wrong, Malrik said. Not a question. Nyra shook her head. I think you're brave. Bravery looks like stupidity until it works. And if it doesn't work, then we burn together. The words should have been ominous. Instead, they felt like a promise. The operation against House Blackwater took 3 weeks to plan and execute. Nyra coordinated with intelligence operatives who'd spent years building networks throughout the eastern provinces. They identified key assets, financial holdings, supply chains, communications networks. Then they dismantled all of it systematically. Bank accounts frozen, grain shipments seized, underground resistance leaders arrested and brought to the capital for questioning. House Blackwater's carefully constructed rebellion started collapsing. Provincial governors who'd been waiting to see which side would win suddenly remembered their loyalty to the crown. Militia groups dissolved. Tax collection resumed. Within a month, the Eastern Territories had stabilized. Not through military brutality, through precision strategy. The court was stunned. Nobles who'd been waiting for Malrik to fail found themselves scrambling to explain why they'd supported aggressive military intervention instead of the approach that actually worked. Commanders who doubted Nyra's strategy started seeking her input on other regional issues. Even General Casimir admitted grudging respect. Maybe the empire can change after all, he said during one meeting. Nyra felt vindicated. Malrik felt relieved. Neither of them saw the real threat coming, because Lord Theron hadn't been working alone. Simits. The betrayal came on a cold night 3 days after the eastern provinces had officially recommitted to crown authority. Nyra was in her chambers reviewing reports when the door burst open. 4 royal guards entered, not her usual protection detail. Different men, faces she recognized from Commander Drelth's unit. You're under arrest, one of them said. Nyra stood slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. On what charge? Treason against the crown, conspiring with enemy forces, sabotaging military operations. The words made no sense. She'd just prevented a rebellion. Where's the king? Indisposed. They grabbed her roughly, chained her wrists, started dragging her toward the door. Nyra didn't resist. Fighting would only make this worse. They hauled her through corridors that should have been filled with servants and guards. Instead, they were empty, abandoned, like the entire palace had been evacuated. They took her to the throne room. The massive chamber was packed. Every noble house, every military commander, every advisor who mattered, all of them watching as she was dragged to the center and forced to her knees. Commander Drelth stood near the throne, not sitting in it, but close enough to suggest authority. General Casimir stood off to one side, face carved from granite. Malrik was nowhere to be seen. Nyra's blood went cold. Commander Drelth stepped forward, voice carrying across the chamber. 3 days ago, he announced, we received intelligence that our trusted advisor was working with House Blackwater, providing them with strategic information, helping them coordinate resistance activities, sabotaging crown operations from the inside. The crowd murmured. Nyra's mind raced. This was impossible. She'd been the one dismantling Blackwater's operations. That's a lie, she said, voice steady. Is it? Drelth continued. Then explain these. He gestured. A servant brought forward a wooden box, opened it to reveal documents, letters, correspondence marked with House Blackwater seals. Drelth pulled out one letter, read aloud. The king trusts me completely. Continue coordinating resistance activities. I'll ensure military responses remain minimal. Together we'll destabilize Crown authority enough that Blackwater can position itself as the logical alternative. He looked at Nyra. Signed with your mark. Nyra stared at the letters. They were perfect forgeries. Her handwriting, her phrasing, even the specific intelligence details that only she would know. Someone had been watching her, documenting her work, building a case, and she'd been too focused on external threats to notice the internal conspiracy. Those are fake, she said, voice harder now. Are they? Drelth asked. Or are you exactly what we feared, a traitor wearing the mask of loyalty? He turned to address the assembled crowd. The evidence is clear. This Omega infiltrated the king's inner circle, gained his trust, convinced him to abandon proven methods in favor of strategies that served her actual masters. She's been playing us from the beginning. The crowd's murmur grew louder, angrier. Where's Malrik? Nyra demanded. The king, Drelth said, voice cold, is currently under protective custody. We believe he's been compromised, possibly through chemical means. His judgment has been severely impaired. Until he recovers, the council has voted to assume temporary authority. Nyra felt the world tilt. This wasn't just about her. This was a coup. They were using her as the excuse to remove Malrik from power. You can't do this, she said. The king is no longer capable of ruling effectively, Drelth interrupted. And you are the proof of his impairment. No rational king would trust someone who tried to kill him. No strong king would let that person influence every major decision. The fact that he did proves he's been compromised. He moved closer, standing over her like an executioner. So here's what's going to happen. You will confess, publicly. Admit your conspiracy. Confirm that you manipulated the king, and in exchange your death will be quick. Nyra met his eyes, saw the calculation there, the ambition, the hunger for power that had been hiding beneath loyalty. And if I refuse, then we torture you until you confess anyway. Either way, you die. The only question is how much you suffer first. The throne room held its breath. Every person there waiting to see if the Omega, who'd somehow survived the Black Wolf's fury, would break under the weight of betrayal. Nyra looked around the room, searching for allies. General Casimir wouldn't meet her eyes. The nobles watched with predatory satisfaction. The commanders stood united behind Drelth. She was alone, completely alone. And that's when she understood the real lesson Malrik had been teaching her all along. Power wasn't about trust. Power wasn't about loyalty. Power was about survival. And survival meant doing whatever was necessary to stay alive long enough to fight back. So Nyra made a choice that would either save her or destroy her completely. She looked at Commander Drelth and said the words that would change everything. I'll confess, but only to the king. Bring him here. Let me face him. Then I'll tell everyone the truth. Drelth smiled, cruel and confident. As you wish. He gestured to the guards. They left to retrieve Malrik. And Nyra knelt in the center of that throne room surrounded by enemies, betting everything on the desperate hope that the man she'd tried to kill and somehow learned to care about would be strong enough to see through the lies before they both burned. They brought Malrik into the throne room in chains, not ceremonial chains, real iron, heavy links that rattled with each step, the kind reserved for prisoners who'd killed royal guards during escape attempts, the kind they'd used on Nyra months ago. He walked between 6 guards, face bruised, lip split, left eye swollen nearly shut. His armor was gone, just torn clothing stained with blood that might have been his or someone else's. His hair hung loose and matted. He looked like a man who'd fought hard and lost harder, but his eyes were clear, furious and clear. The throne room fell silent as they marched him to the center, forced him to his knees 10 feet from where Nyra knelt in her own chains, close enough to see each other, too far to touch. Commander Drelth stood between them like a referee at an execution. "Your Majesty," he said, voice dripping false respect. "Thank you for joining us." Malrik's gaze swept the room, taking inventory. Every noble house represented, every military commander present. General Casimir standing against the far wall with an expression that might have been regret or resignation or both. The king's attention settled on Nyra, assessing damage, looking for injuries beyond the obvious wrist chains and the exhaustion carved into her face. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Nyra saw something that made her blood run cold. Malrik thought she'd actually betrayed him. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at enemies right before burning their kingdoms to ash, like she was a problem that needed permanent solving, like whatever he'd felt for her had been incinerated by proof of treachery. The documents were that good. The conspiracy was that thorough. Commander Drelth had won before the game even started. The commander gestured to a servant who brought forward the box of forged letters, set them on a small table between the kneeling prisoners. "Your Majesty," Drelth began, "we've uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of your court, evidence that your trusted advisor has been working against Crown interests from the beginning." He pulled out the letters one by one, read sections aloud, each one more damning than the last. Detailed intelligence about military operations, strategic weaknesses in eastern defenses, recommendations for how House Blackwater could exploit Crown vulnerabilities. All of it written in Nyra's handwriting, all of it impossible to deny. When Drelth finished reading, he looked at Malrik. "The evidence is clear. Your advisor has been manipulating you, using your trust as a weapon against the Empire. And we believe she's been employing chemical or psychological methods to compromise your judgment." Malrik said nothing, just stared at the letters. The court waited. Nyra felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. Either Malrik believed the forgeries and she died, or he saw through the conspiracy and they both had a chance. Everything depended on whether the Black Wolf King trusted evidence or instinct. Finally, Malrik spoke, voice rough like gravel. "Let me see them." Drelth hesitated. "Your Majesty." "The letters. Let me examine them myself." The commander glanced at the other nobles, subtle confirmation they were still united. Then he brought the letters to Malrik. The king took them with chained hands, held each one up to the torchlight, read slowly, carefully. Nyra watched him process the information, watched doubt flicker across his bruised face, watched the man who'd taught her everything about reading people now being forced to read evidence designed specifically to exploit his worst fears. That caring about someone made him vulnerable. That trust was the weakness that destroyed kings. That love was the disease that killed empires. Every forged letter confirmed what Malrik had spent 15 years believing. That opening yourself to another person gave them the power to destroy you completely. And now he was staring at proof that he'd been right all along. Malrik set down the last letter, looked at Nyra. The silence stretched like a blade across skin. Then he turned to Commander Drelth. "These are forgeries," Malrik said flatly. The throne room erupted, nobles shouting protests, commanders demanding explanation, Drelth's face going red with barely controlled fury. The commander raised his hand for silence. "Your Majesty," he said through clenched teeth. "With respect, the evidence is manufactured," Malrik interrupted. "Expertly done. Almost perfect. But still fake." He held up one of the letters. "This one references a military operation in the eastern provinces that was classified until 3 days ago. Nyra couldn't have known about it when this letter was supposedly written 2 weeks ago. Unless she has the ability to see the future. He dropped the letter. Picked up another. This one mentions grain shipments through the Northern Pass. But House Blackwater doesn't use the Northern Pass. They use the Eastern route because tariffs are lower. Anyone actually working with them would know that. He went through each letter, pointing out inconsistencies. Details that were almost right, but subtly wrong. The kind of mistakes someone would make if they were building a conspiracy from intelligence reports rather than actual insider knowledge. By the time he finished, doubt was spreading through the throne room like poison in water. Drelth's expression had gone from confident to dangerous. "You're defending her," he said, voice hard. "Even now. Even with evidence. You're so compromised you can't see reason." Malrik stood up slowly, chains rattling, guards tensing. "I'm not compromised," he said quietly. "I'm just better at reading people than you are at forging letters." He turned to address the full court, voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "This isn't about my advisor. This is about ambitious commanders who think the Empire would be better served with them in charge, who've been waiting for an excuse to remove me from power, who manufactured evidence because they couldn't find real crimes to justify a coup." Drelth stepped forward. "That's not—" General Casimir's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "He's right." Every head turned. The old soldier pushed off from the wall, walked slowly toward the center of the room, each step deliberate. "I've been watching this develop for weeks," Casimir continued. "Watching commanders meet in private, watching nobles exchange letters, watching a conspiracy build itself around the excuse that the king had gone soft." He stopped next to Malrik. "But the truth is simpler than conspiracy. The truth is that some men can't handle change, can't accept that strength might look different than it did 15 years ago, can't imagine an empire built on something other than fear and brutality." Casimir looked directly at Drelth. "So they manufactured a crisis to justify removing the king who wanted to evolve past the methods that built this empire in the first place." The throne room was silent enough to hear hearts beating. Drelth's hand moved toward his sword. Bad decision. Because the moment his fingers touched the hilt, Malrik moved. Still chained, still injured, still the most dangerous predator in the room. He covered the distance between them in 3 strides, grabbed Drelth by the throat with both manacled hands, slammed him backward against the nearest pillar hard enough to crack stone. The guards froze, uncertain whether to intervene. Malrik leaned close to Drelth's face, voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire chamber. "You made one critical mistake," he said. "You thought I was weak because I was trying to change, but evolution doesn't make predators weaker. It makes them more dangerous." His grip tightened. "The old king would have killed you quickly, out of habit, out of efficiency. But this version understands something far worse than death." Drelth's face was turning purple. "This version understands that some men need to live long enough to watch everything they tried to build collapse around them." Malrik released him. Drelth collapsed to the floor, gasping. The king turned to the assembled court. Every noble, every commander, every person who'd gathered to watch him fall. "Anyone else?" he asked quietly. "Anyone else want to test whether the Black Wolf has lost his teeth?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was absolute. Malrik gestured to the guards still standing near Nyra. "Release her, now!" They rushed to obey, unlocking chains, stepping back quickly like she might explode. Nyra stood slowly, wrists bleeding where iron had cut skin, legs shaking from kneeling too long. But her eyes were steady. She walked to Malrik's side, stood next to him facing the court. 2 predators who'd tried to destroy each other now presenting a united front against everyone who wanted them broken. The king addressed the room one final time. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "Commander Drelth and anyone who actively participated in this conspiracy will be arrested, tried, sentenced appropriately. Their positions will be filled by people loyal to the crown's actual interest instead of their own ambitions." He paused. "And my advisor remains exactly where she is. Anyone who questions that decision is welcome to challenge her directly. See how well that works out. Nobody challenged." Malrik looked at General Casimir. "Take command of the arrest operations. I want this done cleanly. No massacres, no brutality, just justice." The general nodded, already moving toward Drelth. The king turned and walked out of the throne room. Nyra followed. Behind them, the Empire's power structure began reorganizing itself around the reality that the Black Wolf King hadn't lost his strength. He'd just redirected it toward targets who actually deserved destruction. They didn't speak until reaching Malrik's private chambers. The guards outside nodded acknowledgement but stayed in the corridor. Understanding that whatever happened next required privacy, Malrik entered first, moved directly to the table where he kept wine, poured 2 glasses with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline crash. Nyra closed the door, leaned against it, every muscle in her body screaming exhaustion. They drank in silence for a moment. Then Malrik set down his glass and turned to face her fully. Blood still dried on his face, eye swelling shut, lips split. He looked like violence personified. "They beat you," Nyra said quietly. Malrik nodded. "Drelt's personal guards tried to convince me you'd actually betrayed me. When words didn't work, they switched to fists. Did you believe them?" "For about 30 seconds. Until I realized the letters were too perfect, too exactly what they needed them to be. Real conspiracies are messy. This was clean. Manufactured." Nyra felt something unclench in her chest. Relief or grief or the complicated mixture of both. "I thought you were going to let them execute me," she admitted. "I thought about it." The honesty landed like a stone in deep water. Malrik moved closer, close enough that Nyra could see the details of his injuries, the way someone had deliberately beaten him to break his will without killing him. "Do you know what they told me?" he asked, "while they were breaking my ribs?" "What?" "That caring about you made me weak, that trusting you was the proof I'd lost my edge, that the Black Wolf King who built an empire on ruthlessness had become a fool who let an Omega manipulate him into destroying everything he'd built." He stopped inches away from her. "And you want to know the worst part?" he continued, voice barely above whisper. "Part of me believed them. Part of me thought maybe they were right. Maybe I had gone soft. Maybe you were the weakness that would bring down everything I'd spent 15 years creating." Nyra's throat tightened. "And now I understand that they were absolutely right. The words should have been devastating. Instead, they sounded like freedom." "You do make me weak," Malrik said. "Every time I look at you, I think about all the ways caring about someone can be used against me. Every decision I make gets filtered through the question of how it affects you. Every threat to the Empire becomes a threat to you." He reached up, touched her face gently despite the violence still written across his own. "You're the weakness that terrifies me," he said. "The vulnerability I swore I'd never allow. The crack in the armor that enemies will eventually exploit." His hand moved to cup her jaw. "And I don't care anymore." Nyra felt her breath catch. "The Empire can burn," Malrik continued, voice rough with emotion. "The nobles can plot. The commanders can scheme. Let them all try. Because the alternative is going back to being the king who survived by staying alone. And I'd rather risk everything than become that person again." His forehead pressed against hers. "I choose you," he said. "Over safety, over strategy, over everything my father taught me about power and survival. I choose the weakness that makes me human instead of the strength that made me a monster." Nyra's hands came up to grip his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles, the trembling that came from finally admitting something you'd been terrified to acknowledge. "This is insane," she whispered. "Completely insane. We're going to destroy each other. Probably. The Empire will never accept this. Then the Empire adapts or falls." Nyra pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. One swollen shut, one burning with intensity that bordered on madness. "You realize this changes nothing about who we are," she said. "I'm still the person who tried to kill you. You're still the king who built an empire on fear. We're both broken and violent and completely wrong for each other." Malrik smiled then, blood on his teeth. "I know," he said. "That's what makes this interesting." Then he kissed her, like surrender, like war, like two people who'd spent their entire lives building walls around their hearts, finally deciding that walls were lonelier than the risk of letting someone past the defenses. The kiss tasted like blood and wine, and the particular desperation that came from knowing this was either salvation or damnation, and not caring which. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Nyra rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, fast and irregular. "What happens now?" she asked. Now we figure out if an empire built on fear can transform into something built on trust, or if we just burn everything down and start over. That's not a plan. It's the only plan we have. Nyra laughed, bitter and exhausted. We're going to fail spectacularly. Malrik's arms tightened around her. Then we fail together. And in that moment, standing in the private chambers of the Black Wolf King, surrounded by weapons and maps and the ghosts of everyone who'd tried to destroy them, they both understood something fundamental about power. Real strength wasn't about building walls high enough to keep everyone out. Real strength was about lowering those walls for the right person and trusting that the vulnerability wouldn't destroy you. It was the most terrifying gamble either of them had ever taken. More terrifying than war. More terrifying than rebellion. More terrifying than anything the Empire could throw at them. Because warfare was predictable. Love was chaos. And chaos was what transformed kingdoms or burned them to ash. The arrests happened overnight. General Casimir personally oversaw the operation. Commander Drelth and 17 other conspirators were taken into custody. Not brutally, not publicly, just efficiently. By morning, the palace had reorganized itself around a new reality. The Black Wolf King hadn't fallen. He'd evolved, and evolution was more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Nyra spent the next 3 days helping coordinate the transition. New commanders promoted. Loyal officers given expanded authority. The entire military command structure rebuilt to remove anyone who'd supported the coup attempt. It was exhausting work, but necessary. Because empires didn't transform through good intentions. They transformed through systematic dismantling of old power structures and careful construction of new ones. On the 4th day, Malrik called her to the war chamber. She found him standing over the strategy table covered in reports. His injuries were healing, eyes still bruised but functional, lips scabbed over. He'd shaved and pulled his hair back, looking more like the king and less like a man who'd been beaten half to death. "Close the door," he said. Nyra did. Malrik gestured to the reports spread across the table. "House Blackwater has formally requested negotiation," he said. "They claim Drelth acted without their authorization, that they had no knowledge of the conspiracy, that they remain loyal to the crown. You don't believe them. I believe they're smart enough to maintain plausible deniability, but I also believe they were absolutely involved. So what do you want to do?" Nyra studied the maps. The Eastern Territories marked in various colors indicating stability levels. House Blackwater's holdings highlighted in gold. "We could arrest Lord Theron," she said. "Charge him with conspiracy. Make an example." Malrik shook his head. "That starts a war. His house has enough military support to put up serious resistance. Then we negotiate. Accept their claims of loyalty. Monitor them carefully. That leaves them in position to try again." Nyra was quiet for a moment, thinking through options. "There's a third approach," she said finally. Malrik looked at her, waiting. "We give them exactly what they want. Explain." Nyra moved around the table, pointing to different regions. House Blackwater positioned itself as the moderate voice in the East, the reasonable alternative to crown brutality. So we let them be that. We grant the eastern provinces more autonomy, let Blackwater administer them with minimal crown interference. That's rewarding rebellion. No, that's calling their bluff. Because autonomy comes with responsibility. If the eastern provinces thrive under Blackwater management, they were right and we were wrong. If the provinces collapse, everyone sees that Blackwater was never about helping people, just about acquiring power. Malrik studied the maps, processing the strategy. "Either way, we win," Nyra continued. "If they succeed, the Empire benefits from a well-managed region. If they fail, they lose credibility permanently. And if they use autonomy to build military strength for another rebellion attempt, then we have legal justification to crush them completely, because they'll have broken the terms of the agreement." The king was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, sharp and predatory. "You're terrifying," he said. "I taught you to think strategically, but this is beyond strategy. This is weaponized trust. You taught me that too." "When? When you decided to trust me after I tried to kill you. You turned vulnerability into a weapon by refusing to let it be a weakness." Malrik moved around the table, standing close enough that Nyra could feel heat radiating from him. "I'm going to implement your plan," he said. "Give Blackwater autonomy. See what they do with it. And if they betray that trust, I'll personally burn their holdings to the ground." Sounds reasonable. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Do you understand what we're doing? He asked quietly. We're rebuilding an entire empire on the assumption that people are worth trusting, that fear isn't the only way to maintain power, that transformation is possible. Yes, and if we're wrong, thousands of people die. Nyra met his eyes. Then we better not be wrong. Malrik kissed her then. Gentle compared to the violence of a few nights ago, like he was learning how to hold something without crushing it. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. I've spent 15 years believing love was weakness, he said. That caring about anyone made you vulnerable, that the only way to survive was to stay alone. And now I think I was wrong about everything except one thing. What's that? Love is absolutely a weakness, but it's the kind of weakness that makes you stronger by forcing you to protect something beyond yourself. Nyra's hands gripped his shoulders. We're going to fail, she said. Probably multiple times. This empire wasn't built to run on trust and transformation. It was built on fear and domination. I know. We're gambling everything on the possibility that people can change. I know. Most likely, we both die trying. Malrik smiled against her skin. Then we die doing something worth dying for. The word settled between them like a promise or a prophecy or both. Outside the war chamber, the empire continued its transformation. Commanders learning new methods, nobles adjusting to new expectations, provinces tentatively testing whether the crown's promises of change were real or just another manipulation. Inside, two predators stood together, planning the systematic dismantling of everything they'd been taught about power. It was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever attempted, more dangerous than war, more dangerous than rebellion, more dangerous than love. Because love between broken people was survivable. But love between broken people trying to rebuild an empire from fear into something better. That was the kind of love that either saved kingdoms or burned them to ash. And neither Malrik nor Nyra knew which outcome awaited them. They only knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were doing this together, come what may. Mtsig. The formal announcement came 3 days later. A public declaration in the main square where Nyra had nearly been executed months ago, where the execution platform had stood before being dismantled, where thousands of citizens gathered to hear the Black Wolf King address his empire. Malrik stood on a raised platform wearing full royal regalia. Crown, armor, every symbol of authority. Nyra stood beside him, not behind, not hidden, beside him as an equal. The message was clear before he even spoke. The empire had changed. Malrik's voice carried across the square. Citizens of Drakkar, he began, for 15 years, I have ruled this empire through strength and fear. I built our borders through conquest, maintained our stability through intimidation, created a kingdom that others feared to challenge. The crowd was silent, listening. But fear has limits, he continued. Fear creates obedience, but it doesn't create loyalty. Fear builds walls, but it doesn't build futures. Fear maintains power, but it doesn't build something worth protecting. He paused. So today, I announce a new direction for this empire. One built on accountability instead of terror. One that rewards competence over brutality. One that understands strength comes not from crushing dissent, but from building something people choose to defend. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Malrik gestured to Nyra. This is my advisor. Many of you know her story. She tried to kill me. I should have executed her. Instead, I chose transformation. And that choice has shown me that change is possible even for the most broken among us. He turned to address the full square. The old empire dies today. What rises in its place will be built by all of us together, not through fear, through partnership. The speech continued. Details about new policies, provincial autonomy, accountability systems, everything designed to show the empire that transformation was real. But Nyra barely heard the words. She was watching the crowd, seeing faces that ranged from skeptical to hopeful to furious, seeing an empire struggling to decide if change was salvation or suicide. And she understood then what Malrik had known all along. This wasn't about whether they succeeded or failed. This was about whether they had the courage to try. Because empires built on fear lasted as long as the fear remained stronger than the resentment. But empires built on something worth protecting, Those had the potential to last forever, or burn spectacularly. Either way, the story would be legendary. As Malrik finished his speech and the crowd erupted in mixed reactions, Nyra felt his hand find hers. A simple gesture. A public declaration. The Black Wolf King holding hands with the weapon he'd forged and then chosen to love instead of destroy. The crowd saw it. The nobles saw it. The entire empire saw it. And in that moment, standing on a platform where she should have died, Nyra understood the final lesson Malrik had been teaching her all along. Power wasn't about being untouchable. Power was about being willing to be touched and trusting that vulnerability wouldn't destroy you. It was the most dangerous gamble in human history, and they were betting everything on it. The speech ended. The crowd dispersed. The empire began its uncertain transformation, and high above the square, in a palace window, General Casimir watched it all unfold with an expression that mixed pride and terror in equal measure. Because he'd served 3 kings, watched 2 of them die, and this 3rd king was either the bravest or most foolish ruler in history. Time would tell which. But either way, Casimir knew one thing with absolute certainty. The empire would never be the same, for better or worse. The Black Wolf had finally learned to love, and love was the most dangerous weapon any king had ever wielded. The rebellion came exactly 6 months after the public announcement, not from the eastern provinces where everyone expected it, from the north. 3 noble houses who'd been quietly consolidating power while the empire focused on transformation. Houses whose bloodlines predated the throne itself. Houses who remembered when kings were chosen by council vote instead of inherited through conquest. They called themselves the Old Guard, and they wanted the empire returned to traditional rule. The letter arrived at dawn, delivered by a messenger who collapsed in the throne room courtyard with 3 arrows in his back. He'd ridden through the night from the northern territories, dying to deliver a declaration that would reshape everything. General Casimir brought the blood-stained parchment to Malrik's war chamber, where the king stood studying supply routes with Nyra. The old soldier's face was carved from stone. "It started," he said simply. Malrik took the letter. "Read it once," then handed it to Nyra without speaking. She read the formal language that barely disguised the threat underneath. The Old Guard demanded the removal of the Omega Advisor, the restoration of traditional military command, the return to proven methods of imperial governance, and if these demands were not met within 14 days, they would march on the capital with armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Civil war. The thing every empire feared most. Kingdom against itself. Nyra set down the letter. Her hands were steady, but her voice carried weight when she spoke. "This is because of me." Malrik's expression was unreadable. "This is because of change. You're just the symbol they're using to justify resistance. Same result. People die because I'm here. People die because power-hungry nobles want control and will use any excuse to take it." General Casimir moved to the window overlooking the training yards where soldiers were running morning drills. Young men who'd never fought in a real war, who'd grown up during 15 years of relative peace built on fear and intimidation. Now they'd be asked to fight their own countrymen. "We have 14 days, Casimir said, "to prepare, to negotiate, to decide how we respond." Malrik joined him at the window, watching soldiers who didn't yet know they were about to become casualties in a war over whether empires could transform without burning. "There's nothing to decide," the king said quietly. "We don't negotiate with threats. We prepare for war." The general nodded. Expected response. He'd served 3 kings, and they all said variations of the same thing when faced with rebellion. But then Malrik continued, "And we make sure that when this war is over, the survivors understand why it was fought. Not for my pride, not for tradition, but for the principle that empires evolve or die." Casimir turned to look at him. "That's a dangerous message. It's the only message worth fighting for." Nyra had been quiet during this exchange. Now she spoke, voice cutting through the tension. "There's another option." Both men turned to her. "I leave," she said. "Remove the symbol they're rallying against. Give them what they claim to want. Maybe that prevents the war entirely." Malrik's eyes flashed. "Absolutely not. It's logical. One person versus tens of thousands of deaths. Logic doesn't apply when the excuse is manufactured. The Old Guard doesn't actually care about you specifically. They care about power. If you leave, they'll find another excuse, another symbol, another justification for taking control. He moved closer to her. This war is inevitable, he said. Has been since the moment I chose transformation over tradition. Your presence didn't cause it. It just gave them a convenient target. Nyra held his gaze, searching for doubt, finding only certainty. People will die because you won't compromise. People will die because the old guard chose violence over adaptation. That's on them, not us. The words hung in the war chamber like smoke. General Casimir cleared his throat. I'll begin mobilization, he said. Full military preparation. We have 14 days before they march. That's enough time to fortify the capital and position our forces. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, he said without looking back, I think you're both right. This war is inevitable. And it's about more than just power. It's about whether fear or trust build stronger kingdoms. He left, leaving Malrik and Nyra alone in the war chamber surrounded by maps that would soon be marked with battle positions and casualty estimates. Nyra felt exhaustion settling into her bones, not physical tiredness, the deeper kind that came from fighting constantly against people who wanted you destroyed simply for existing. I'm tired, she admitted quietly. Malrik moved to stand beside her at the strategy table. His hand found hers. I know. Tired of being the weapon everyone wants to use or destroy? Tired of being the excuse for violence? Tired of watching everything we try to build get attacked before it even has a chance to grow? His fingers tightened around hers. Do you regret it? He asked. Staying, helping me try to transform this empire. Nyra was silent for a long moment, thinking about the past 6 months, the victories and failures, the slow progress and sudden setbacks, the constant pressure of being watched by an empire that wanted her gone. No, she said finally, I don't regret it. But I'm starting to understand why most people choose the easier path, why they accept traditional power structures instead of trying to change them, because change is exhausting, and the people who resist change are relentless. Malrik turned her to face him, both hands cupping her face now. Listen to me, he said, voice intense. You are the bravest person I've ever known, not because you tried to kill me, not because you survived training designed to break you, because you looked at a broken empire and decided it was worth fixing instead of just escaping. Nyra felt her throat tighten. That bravery is what makes you dangerous to people like the old guard, Malrik continued, because you prove that change is possible, that empires don't have to run on fear forever, that there's another way, and if that other way gets us both killed, then we die proving it was possible. The words should have been terrifying. Instead, they felt like absolution, because both of them had spent so long surviving that they'd forgotten what it meant to live for something beyond survival. Now they were learning, and the lesson was brutal, but maybe that's what transformation required. Brutality, blood, the willingness to burn everything down and trust that something better would grow from the ashes. Outside the war chamber, the empire prepared for civil war. Inside, two broken people held each other and prepared to fight for a future they might not live to see. The 14 days passed like water through clenched fists. Military mobilization, supply chain fortification, intelligence gathering about the old guard's actual strength versus their claimed numbers. The capital city transformed into a fortress. Civilians were evacuated to southern territories. Soldiers fortified walls that hadn't seen real combat in 15 years. Weapons forges ran day and night producing armor and blades. The empire was preparing to tear itself apart. On the 13th day, a second messenger arrived. This one made it through alive, though barely. He carried a counter-proposal from the old guard. Single combat. The traditional way disputes were settled before empires grew too large for individual battles to matter. Champion versus champion. Winner takes control. The old guard would send their finest warrior. The crown would send theirs. One fight, one outcome. Winner's terms became law. It was the kind of dramatic gesture that appealed to people who valued tradition over practicality. Malrik read the proposal in front of his full war council. Every commander, every advisor, General Casimir standing near the king like an ancient pillar. When he finished reading, the room exploded. It's a trap, one commander said immediately. They wouldn't offer single combat unless they were certain their champion would win, which means they have someone exceptional, another added. Someone they've been training specifically for this. We should refuse, a third concluded, continue with full military preparation. But General Casimir was quiet, thinking. Finally, he spoke. If we refuse, the old guard claims we're afraid, that the new methods are weak, that tradition is superior. They win the narrative even if they lose the war. And if we accept, someone else countered, we risk everything on one fight. The general looked at Malrik. Sometimes one fight is the only way to prove a point. The room went silent, everyone understanding what he was suggesting. The king turned to Nyra. She'd been standing near the wall watching the debate unfold. Now she met his eyes and saw the question there. You can't, she said immediately. Malrik smiled slightly. Can't what? Fight their champion yourself. You're not trained for single combat anymore. You've been ruling for 15 years. Your skills are strategic now, not martial. I was trained by the same masters who built this empire's military reputation 15 years ago. Bodies change, reflexes slow. You'd be fighting someone in their prime who's been preparing specifically for this. The king moved closer to her, close enough that only she could hear him speak. This is the only way, he said quietly. If I send a champion, the old guard claims I'm hiding behind others. If I refuse the challenge, they claim I'm weak. If I fight and lose, at least I die, proving I was willing to risk everything for what I believe in. And if you die, Nyra said, voice breaking slightly, the empire falls back into the hands of people who rule through fear and tradition. Then you'll have to prevent that. The words landed like stones. Malrik turned back to address the full council. I accept their challenge, he announced. Single combat. My champion against theirs. He paused. And I will be the champion. The council erupted again, protests, arguments, demands that he reconsider. But Malrik's decision was final. The message went out that afternoon. The Black Wolf King would face the Old Guard's champion in single combat, 7 days from now, in the ancient fighting grounds outside the capital, where such disputes had been settled for centuries. Winner takes control of the empire. Loser gets buried with honor. The entire kingdom would watch, and history would remember who proved their methods were superior. Thus, Malrik spent the next 6 days training like a man possessed. Every morning before dawn, he was in the practice yards, sparring with the best fighters in the royal guard, drilling techniques he hadn't used in years, pushing his body past the limits of what a king in his 30s should reasonably be able to endure. Nyra watched from the sidelines, unable to help, unable to stop him. Just watching the man she'd tried to kill and somehow learned to love, prepare to die for principles most people thought were naive. On the 5th day of training, she finally couldn't take it anymore. She waited until he'd finished his morning session, until the practice yard was empty except for them and the rising sun. Then she approached where he sat, catching his breath against the training post. You're going to get killed, she said flatly. Malrik looked up at her, sweat dripping down his face, muscles trembling from exhaustion. Probably, he agreed. That's it. Just probably. No strategy, no contingency plan. The strategy is to fight well enough that even if I lose, people remember why I fought. That's not a strategy. That's suicide with philosophy attached. Malrik stood slowly, every movement showing the toll 6 days of brutal training had taken. You want to know what I learned over the past 15 years? He asked. What building an empire on fear taught me? Nyra waited. I learned that fear works, he said. It's efficient. It's predictable. It builds obedience quickly. But it doesn't build anything worth protecting. It doesn't inspire loyalty. It doesn't create bonds stronger than the fear itself. He moved closer to her. So when I die in that arena, he continued, I'll die proving that there was another way. That empires can run on trust and accountability instead of terror. That transformation is possible even for the most broken systems. And if that lesson dies with you, then you teach it, Malrik said simply. You survive. You continue the work. You prove that change wasn't just my delusion, but an actual viable path forward. Nyra felt something crack in her chest. The careful control she'd been maintaining for 6 days finally fracturing. I can't do this without you, she admitted, voice raw. Yes, you can. I trained you specifically for this. To be strong enough to continue even when I'm gone. That's not fair. None of this is fair. But it's necessary. He pulled her close, arms wrapping around her like he was trying to memorize the feeling. I need you to understand something, he said quietly. If I die in that arena, it won't be because I was weak. It'll be because I chose to risk everything for a principle. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever done. Nyra buried her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, fast and strong despite the exhaustion. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. I know, but you might have to. And if you do, you have to promise me something. What? That you'll keep fighting, keep pushing for transformation, keep proving that empires can change. Don't let my death become the excuse to go back to the old ways. Nyra pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face for the first time since being captured months ago. That's a lot to ask. I know. I might fail. Then you fail trying, which is more than most people ever do. He kissed her then, gentle and desperate simultaneously, like a man trying to compress a lifetime of affection into one moment. When they separated, Nyra gripped his shoulders hard enough to bruise. Don't you dare lose, she said fiercely. Don't you dare die in that arena and leave me to clean up this mess alone. Malrik smiled, that sharp, predatory smile that reminded her why they called him the Black Wolf. I'll do my best. Your best better be enough. We'll find out tomorrow. The ancient fighting ground sat in a natural amphitheater carved by centuries of erosion into the volcanic rock north of the capital. Stone seats rose in tiers around a central arena, space for thousands of spectators to watch combat that would determine the fate of kingdoms. By dawn, every seat was filled. Citizens who'd traveled from across the empire to witness history. Nobles positioned in the best viewing areas. Military commanders arranged by rank. Common soldiers standing in designated sections. Even the old guard came, sitting in positions of honor across from where the crown's supporters gathered. The entire empire compressed into one location, all of them waiting to see which vision would survive. Nyra sat in the royal viewing box, General Casimir beside her. Neither spoke, both watching the empty arena below where two men would soon fight to determine whether fear or trust built stronger kingdoms. The sun rose higher, and then the champions entered. The old guard's fighter came first, a massive alpha named Volkan, who'd spent 20 years fighting in underground combat circuits before being recruited specifically for this moment. He stood 7 feet tall, muscle layered over muscle, scars covering his exposed arms and chest like territorial markers. He looked like violence incarnate. The crowd roared approval when he raised his sword. Then Malrik entered. He wore simple armor, black leather reinforced with steel plates, a sword that had belonged to his brother 15 years ago. No crown, no royal regalia, just a man preparing to fight for what he believed in. He looked small compared to Vulcan, human compared to a monster, but he walked into that arena like he owned it. The crowd's noise shifted, uncertainty mixing with anticipation. Nyra felt her hands clenching so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. General Casimir's voice was barely audible beside her. If he dies, what do we do? We continue his work, Nyra said, voice steadier than she felt. We prove that his death meant something. The general nodded slowly. Then may whatever forces govern this world give him strength. The two fighters met in the center of the arena. A neutral referee read the terms. Single combat to surrender or death. No outside interference. Winner's terms become law. Volkan smiled, showing teeth filed to points. Your king dies today, he said loud enough for the entire arena to hear. And your empire returns to proper rule. Malrik's expression was calm. My empire, he said quietly, only for Vulcan, was never about me. It was about proving that change is possible. So whether I live or die today doesn't actually matter. The idea survives either way. Vulcan's smile widened. Then die knowing your idea was weak. The referee stepped back, raised his hand, dropped it. The fight began. Vulcan moved fast for someone his size, closing distance quickly. His sword was massive, designed for overwhelming power rather than precision. The first strike would have decapitated a normal fighter. Malrik wasn't normal. He moved like water around stone, letting the blade pass inches from his face, counter-striking at exposed ribs. His sword connected, drew blood. First point to the king. The crowd noise swelled. Volkan growled, pressed harder, using size advantage to force Malrik backward, each strike heavy enough to shatter bones if it connected. But Malrik had spent 15 years learning strategy, learning to think 3 moves ahead, learning that battles weren't won through strength alone. They were won through pattern recognition. He watched Volkan's footwork, saw the tell before each major strike, the slight shift in weight, the micro-adjustment in stance, and he used it. When Volkan committed to a massive overhead swing, Malrik stepped inside the range, too close for the blade to be effective. His own sword found the gap between armor plates at Volkan's shoulder, deep penetration, arterial hit, blood sprayed across volcanic stone. Volkan staggered, shocked that this smaller man had hurt him seriously. The crowd erupted, split between celebration and horror. But the fight wasn't over. Volkan switched his sword to his offhand, still functional despite the shoulder wound, and he came at Malrik with renewed fury. No more testing, no more strategy, just overwhelming violence meant to end this quickly. Malrik tried to evade, but 15 years of ruling instead of fighting showed. His reflexes were half a second too slow. Volkan's blade caught him across the ribs. Not a killing blow, but deep enough to matter. Blood soaked through Malrik's armor instantly. The king stumbled, felt his legs weaken. Across the arena, in the royal viewing box, Nyra stood up, hands gripping the stone railing hard enough to crack. She watched Malrik take the hit, watched him struggle to maintain footing, watched blood spreading across his left side. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to run into that arena and stop this before it killed him. But she couldn't. The rules were absolute. Interference meant automatic forfeiture. So she stood there powerless, while the man she'd learned to love fought for his life below. General Casimir's hand found her shoulder. Steady presence in the chaos. "He's not done yet," the old soldier said. "How can you tell?" "Because I know that look. He's planning something." Down in the arena, Malrik forced himself upright. The rib wound burned like fire. His vision was starting to blur from blood loss. But his mind was still clear, still calculating. Volkan approached for the killing blow, confident now, sensing victory. That confidence was his weakness. Malrik waited, watching. Patient despite pain, Volkan raised his sword. Malrik saw the pattern. The same tell as before, the weight shift, the stance adjustment. And this time, instead of evading, he moved into the strike. Let Volkan's blade slide past his shoulder by millimeters, and drove his own sword upward through the gap under Volkan's raised arm, into the armpit where major arteries ran unprotected, through flesh and into chest cavity, piercing heart, instant kill. Volkan's eyes went wide, shock replacing confidence. He dropped his sword, staggered, fell, dead before he hit the stone. The arena went absolutely silent, thousands of people processing what they'd just witnessed. The Black Wolf King, injured, bleeding, half dead himself, standing over the corpse of the Old Guard's champion. Then the crowd exploded, half cheering, half screaming, the Empire splitting down the middle over what this outcome meant. But in the royal viewing box, Nyra was already moving, running down the stairs, pushing through crowds, heading for the arena entrance. She reached Malrik just as he collapsed, caught him before he hit the ground, lowered him gently against her. His breathing was labored, shallow, the rib wound worse than it looked. "That was stupid," she said, voice breaking. "Completely stupid and reckless, and you almost died." Malrik smiled weakly. "But I didn't. You will if we don't get you to a healer. Then I suggest you hurry." Nyra looked up, saw General Casimir approaching with medics, saw the crowd still in chaos, saw an empire trying to process what transformation actually required. Blood, pain, the willingness to die for principles most people thought were naive. But Malrik was alive, and alive meant they'd bought themselves time. Time to prove that empires could change. That fear didn't have to be permanent. That love between broken people trying to build something better wasn't weakness, but the strongest foundation any kingdom could have. As medics loaded Malrik onto a stretcher, Nyra gripped his hand. "Don't ever do that again," she said fiercely. He squeezed back, weak but present. "No promises." She laughed, tears streaming down her face, mixing grief and relief in equal measure. The stretcher moved toward waiting carriages that would rush the king back to the palace. And behind them, the Empire began the slow process of accepting that the old ways were dead. Long live transformation. Long live trust. Long live the Black Wolf who'd finally learned that some things were worth dying for, and worth living for even more. Well, Malrik spent 3 weeks recovering. The rib wound had collapsed 1 lung and fractured 2 ribs. Infection set in on the 4th day despite healers' best efforts. Fever burned through him for 6 days straight. He came close to dying 3 separate times. But he was stubborn, and Nyra refused to let him quit. She spent every night in his recovery chambers, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, forcing water down his throat when fever made him delirious, changing bandages when healers needed rest. On the 7th night, when fever finally broke, Malrik opened his eyes to find her asleep in the chair, her hand wrapped around his, dark circles under her eyes, looking exhausted and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. "You stayed," he said, voice rough from disuse. Nyra jolted awake, took a moment to process that he was conscious, actually conscious instead of fever dream talking. "You're awake." "Barely." She poured water, helped him drink, checked his forehead for renewed fever. "You almost died," she said. "Multiple times. Your body tried very hard to give up. My body doesn't know me very well then." Nyra sat back down, still holding his hand. "The Empire is waiting," she said quietly, "to see if you survived, to learn what happens next. What does happen next?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd captured her, trained her, almost killed her, then somehow became the person she'd fight the entire world to protect. "We build something better," she said. "We prove that your stupid risk actually meant something. We transform this empire into something worth the blood you spilled for it." Malrik smiled weakly. "Sounds exhausting." "It will be. Worth it, though." Nyra leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "You ever do something that reckless again," she whispered, "and I'll kill you myself." "No, you won't." "Why not?" "Because you love me, and love makes us do stupid protective things." The admission hung between them. First time either had actually said the word out loud instead of dancing around it. Malrik felt her tears on his skin. "Say it again," he asked quietly. Nyra pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. "I love you," she said, voice steady despite the tears. "I love you, and I hate you, and I'm terrified of how much power that gives you to destroy me. But I don't care anymore, because trying to protect myself from loving you is more exhausting than just admitting it." Malrik's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away tears. "I love you too," he said. "I've loved you since the moment you spat blood at my feet in the throne room and glared at me like you could kill me with pure fury. I just didn't know how to admit that love wasn't weakness. And now I know it's the most dangerous and powerful thing I've ever wielded." They stayed like that for a long time. Foreheads pressed together, breathing synchronized. 2 broken people who'd found each other in the ruins and decided to build something new. Eventually, Nyra spoke again. "The old guard surrendered after your victory. Formal documents recognizing crown authority, accepting the new methods. They're not happy about it, but they're compliant. For now. For now. We'll have to stay vigilant, always do." She squeezed his hand. "General Casimir wants to officially retire. He says the Empire needs younger blood-leading military operations. People who believe in transformation instead of just enduring it. Do we have those people? We're building them. It'll take time." "But yes." Malrik nodded slowly, processing all the work that remained. "You know what I realized?" he said, "while I was dying from fever." "What?" "That empires don't actually change through single moments. They change through thousands of small decisions made by people who choose trust over fear every single day. My victory in the arena wasn't the transformation. It was just proof that transformation was possible. The real work starts now." "Yes, and it'll be brutal. Long. Full of setbacks and resistance. Probably. People will die. Systems will collapse. Everything we try will be attacked by those who profit from the old ways." Malrik looked at her. Really looked. At this Omega who tried to kill him and somehow became the person most responsible for keeping him alive. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather face that with," he said. Nyra smiled, fierce and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. Then let's burn the old empire down and build something worth protecting from the ashes. Bumik. 6 months later, the transformation was still incomplete, still chaotic, still constantly under threat. But it was happening. Provincial governors reported increased compliance with crown directives, not because they feared punishment, because they saw the benefits of accountability systems that rewarded competence over brutality. Trade routes expanded. Merchants who'd avoided Drakkar territories for years started returning. Economies that had stagnated under fear-based rule began growing. Military reforms reduced the size of standing armies while improving training quality. Soldiers who believed in protecting something were more effective than soldiers who feared punishment for failing. And throughout all of it, Nyra and Malrik worked side by side, not as king and advisor anymore, as partners, building something neither could have created alone. On a cold morning in late autumn, they stood together on the palace balcony overlooking the capital. The city was waking up, merchants opening shops, citizens going about daily life, the ordinary, mundane business of people living under a system that was slowly learning to value them as more than just resources to be exploited. "How long do you think it'll take?" Nyra asked, "before people stop questioning whether transformation was worth it?" Malrik considered the question. "Generations," he said finally. "Real change doesn't happen in years. It happens in decades, centuries. We're just planting seeds. Other people will water them, harvest them, build on what we started. That's depressing. We'll probably die before seeing the full results, or inspiring, depending on how you look at it." Nyra leaned against him, feeling the steady presence that had become her anchor in the chaos. "Do you regret it?" she asked, choosing this path instead of continuing the old ways. "Every day," Malrik admitted. "And never." "That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. I regret how hard this is, how much it costs, how many people resist, but I never regret trying, because trying to build something better is the only thing that makes power worth having." He turned to face her fully. 15 years ago, my brother died because I loved him. I spent a decade and a half convincing myself that love was the weakness that killed him, that caring about anyone made you vulnerable, that empires survived through fear alone. And now I know I was wrong about everything. My brother didn't die because I loved him. He died because I wasn't strong enough to protect what I loved, while also being human enough to deserve that love. His hands found hers. "You taught me that," he said. "You taught me that strength and humanity aren't opposites, that the most powerful thing a king can do is admit weakness while still fighting for what matters." Nyra felt tears prickling her eyes again. She'd become softer over the past months, more willing to feel instead of just calculate. "That's terrifying," she said. "What is? How much I need you, how much your survival matters to my ability to function. You've become the weakness that every enemy can exploit." Malrik smiled. "Then we'll just have to make sure neither of us gives enemies the opportunity. That's not a plan. It's the only plan we have." They stood together watching the city wake, watching an empire slowly transform from something built on fear into something built on principles most people thought were naive. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to finished, but it was real. And real change required exactly what they'd given it: blood, pain, the willingness to risk everything for a vision that might fail. Most importantly, it required two broken people who'd found each other in the ruins and decided that building something together was more powerful than surviving alone. That was the real lesson. Not that love conquered all, not that trust always won, not that transformation was easy or inevitable or guaranteed to succeed. The real lesson was simpler and more brutal. Change required people brave enough to try, to fail, to get back up and try again, to risk everything knowing they might lose it all. And the only way to survive that kind of sustained, brutal effort was to find someone who believed in the same impossible future and refused to let go no matter how hard the empire tried to tear you apart. Nyra rested her head against Malrik's shoulder. "Tell me we're going to survive this," she said quietly. "We're going to survive this. You don't know that. No. But I choose to believe it, and belief is the first step toward making impossible things real." The sun rose higher over the capital city of Ashmourne, light spreading across volcanic stone and ancient architecture, illuminating an empire in transition. showing all the cracks and fractures where the old system was breaking down and the new system was still being built. It was messy, it was chaotic, it was absolutely terrifying, and it was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever been part of, because empires built on fear lasted as long as the fear remained stronger than the resentment. But empires built on trust and accountability and the willingness to evolve, those had the potential to last forever, or at least long enough to matter. Far below the balcony, in the city streets, a child laughed. The sound carried up through the morning air, pure and uncomplicated and full of the kind of hope that only came from living in a place where the future felt less terrifying than the past. "That's why we do this," Malrik said, hearing the laughter. "For moments like that. Children who grow up in an empire that values them instead of exploiting them." Nyra listened to the distant laughter. Let it settle in her chest like warmth spreading through cold stone. "Then we better make sure we build something worth their future," she said. "Together. Always together." They turned away from the balcony, heading back into the palace where 1,000 decisions waited, where the brutal daily work of transformation continued, where an empire slowly learned that strength didn't mean domination and power didn't require cruelty. The Black Wolf King and the weapon he'd forged walked side by side through corridors that had witnessed centuries of rulers come and go. And somewhere in those ancient halls, something shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a subtle change in the air itself. The feeling of an empire taking its first real breath after 15 years of suffocation. The beginning of something that might actually survive. And far beyond the palace walls, across mountains and provinces and territories that had spent generations living under fear, people started telling a new story. Not about the ruthless king who crushed dissent before it could breathe, about the broken king who learned to love the weapon he created, who chose transformation over tradition, who risked everything to prove that empires could change, and about the Omega who should have died but instead became the reason an entire kingdom learned that survival wasn't the same as living. Their story would be told for generations, sometimes as warning, sometimes as inspiration, always as proof that the most dangerous thing any ruler could wield wasn't fear or violence or absolute authority. It was the courage to change when change seemed impossible, and the strength to love when love felt like the ultimate weakness. That was the legacy of the Black Wolf and the Crimson Fang. Not perfect, not bloodless, but real. And reality was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The empire would continue evolving, systems would keep transforming, resistance would never fully disappear, but the foundation had been laid. Trust over fear, accountability over brutality. Love is the most powerful weapon any ruler ever wielded. And two broken people who proved that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting you can't do it alone. That was how empires transformed. One impossible decision at a time, one terrifying risk after another, one love strong enough to survive the weight of a kingdom built on its foundation. The story ends here, but the empire continues, forever changed by the predators who learned to care for each other more than they feared what caring could cost them. And that makes all the difference.